Hey everyone, thanks for stopping by. Today we have a collection of my most favorite videos and stories. It is 3 whole hours, so go for a walk, fall asleep, do what you gotta do. I hope you enjoy them as much as I did. Peace. Addiction took our mother slowly, rocked her through it and sung her to sleep, sunk deep into the mattress on her bed. When her back teeth fell out, she left them on the side of the bathtub. I was 7, and I kept them in a matchbox. The missing pieces of her kept safe, so she wouldn't be lost forever. So maybe one day we could put her back together. Our house fell down around us, and we tried our best to raise ourselves. The ceilings had water damage, and the bottom stairs had dry rot, and in the winters, the radiators would bleed rust. But it was still our house, and Annie made it a home. My sister Annie mothered me, with lopsided band-aids on bruised knees and lukewarm microwave meals. She told me ghost stories and didn't mind when I crawled into her bed later on, too scared to sleep alone. She taught me to dance, barefoot on the living room carpet, music channel on full volume on the TV shaking our hips before we were fully grown. She always let me shower first so the water was hot, never complaining when she had to make do with the cold. She brushed my hair every day before school, even when I screamed and hit her when she caught the tangles. Annie was dark-haired like her father, whoever he had been, but I was blonde. Annie was desperate to be blonde too, like Marilyn Monroe, like Mom. I think she thought it would make them closer, remind Mom less of her dad. I'd give anything for her to have her hands in my hair one more time, even if it hurt. She moved to New York when I turned 18 and never came back. I still dream about her sometimes. Keeping up with our mother was impossible, and we learned from a young age we would always be left behind. It didn't make it any easier. When she was drinking light, she shone, would wake us up at 3 a.m. with pancakes dripping in cherry syrup. Sometimes when the weather was right and she'd had enough being drunk alone, she would call our school up and tell them we both had come down with summer sickness and we'd drive to the beach instead. I remember being 9 years old in the back seat of the car coming home after one of our ocean days, sucking the salt from my fingers. Annie had just dyed her hair blonde, her best friend Jane helping her bend over our kitchen sink. From behind I couldn't tell who was mother and who was daughter. Radio up and windows down, blowing the sky inside. When she was drinking heavy, she'd be out all night, hair piled up like a beauty queen, eyes glazed over and ringed with glitter and black. Sometimes she'd be gone for a day or two. She would never tell us when. One day we'd just wake up to an empty house and a fridge packed full, post-it note on the front with a smear of Mom's lipstick and the outline of a kiss, telling us she'd be back soon. Sometimes she'd bring guys home, filling the table with beer cans and ashtrays, smoke up the ceiling, Mom lost in the haze. We'd sleep with pillows over our heads, trying to drown out the music they would blast until the AM, and wake up to strangers at our kitchen table in the morning, asking us where we kept the coffee. When Mom drank too little, she fell apart. She wouldn't buy food, refrigerator a gaping hole in the wall. She'd chain smoke, leaving cigarette burns on the wallpaper up by the stairs like the walls were sick and decaying. She barely slept, walking around with blue half-moons under her eyes, knuckles raw. She would scream at the slightest thing. I remember once I spilled a glass of juice on the couch. She looked over at me with dead eyes and dragged me off onto the carpet and then took every single cushion off the couch and into the backyard and set them on fire. Annie went to watch a while from the window and then sat next to me on the floor, backs pressed against the skeleton of the seats, head resting in the crater of my collarbones. When Mom drank too much was the worst. She'd laugh too loud and too long at anything and everything until her mouth started to shake and she started crying at the breakfast table into her cereal. Annie shut down when Mom was like this, went somewhere deep inside herself where nobody could hurt her, She'd stay up until the morning watching old black and white movies on TV, whispering the lines she knew by heart like prayers. When I was 5, I'd cry when I'd find my mom passed out cold on her bed. Sure she would never wake up. Annie would wipe my tears, tell me she was only sleeping just like the princesses in my storybook. We'd sit on Mom's bed together and wait for her to wake up. When we were older, I was the one who would pick Mom up off the bathroom floor again and again, and Annie would put her to bed, smoothing her hair off her face and the vomit from her mouth, changing her clothes if she'd pissed herself. Watching them then, there was no doubt that Annie was the mother now. It was October and I was 13, Annie 16. It was a Wednesday night and Mom had been gone for 2 days. She'd called us that morning from a payphone, voice slurring down the line, telling us she was having the best time with all her new friends, hoping we were doing fine. When she asked me if I was having a good birthday, I hung up on her. My birthday had been the day before. Annie had given me a pile of presents, strawberry lip glosses and glittery nail polishes. I didn't ask where she got the money from. I didn't care. We'd taken the bus to the beach with Jane, eaten the birthday cake she had made for me, sand getting into the frosting. It tasted like sweetness in the sea, and I savored every bite and scrape of sugar against my teeth. We watched the sun go down. Annie snapping grainy photos on her shitty Nokia as I blew out my candles, wishing over and over that Mom wouldn't come home, that she'd just stay gone this time. But that Wednesday night, me and Annie weren't speaking. Anger hung heavy between us, seeping through the floorboards. It began when she tripped at the bottom of the stairs. We'd both laughed, Annie throwing her head back, gap between her front teeth catching the light. When I bent to pick her up, I'd caught her breath, warm against the freckles on my cheeks. I let go of her arms and she fell again, hitting the floor and grinning, shaking her hair from her face. Her breath was heavy with whiskey. I couldn't start picking her up too. Couldn't watch her fall again and again. Just like Mom, I knew she'd never get back up. I'd stared down at her, blonde hair fallen into her eyes, and all I could see was our mother. And then I was running, feet slamming the hallway like heartbeats turned loose. I'd run for the kitchen and tipped every bottle we had down the sink, shoving Annie back as she fought to stop me, catching liquor on her fingers as it fell. She grabbed my shoulders and made me drop the very last bottle. It smashed between us on the floor, glass shards shining like we dragged the stars out of the sky and broken them, pieces we could never get back. Outside through the open windows, the sky turned pale gold, clouds a mess of pink and cream smeared across the horizon. I cried then, watching Annie on her knees picking up the pieces. That was Annie, always trying to fix things even when it was too late. The smell of food dragged me from my room, stomach turning traitor inside my ribcage. Annie was cooking pasta, real food not made in a microwave. She'd set the table, Tammy Wynette singing softly from the CD player, Annie gently swaying her hips as she stirred the tomato sauce, rich and warm. As we ate in silence, with every bite I forgave her. Mom never cooked dinner or remembered my favorite was spaghetti ever since I was a kid, or stayed sober long enough to sit up at a table. Annie wasn't Mom. We were washing the dishes when we first heard it. A moth was crawling down the inside of the pane and I cracked the window to let it out into the dark. From the backyard came a faint sound. I tilted my head to listen as it was coming from far off, crying. I figured it was Mika, the 2-year-old next door, having a tantrum loud enough for us to catch, or maybe even Lucky Strike, the cat junkies down the street, begging for food like he sometimes did. I always wanted to feed him when he came around, winding over my ankles, but Annie always stopped me, saying once you started giving them, they never stopped taking. Looking back, I don't think she was talking about the cat. Annie flipped the Christmas lights strung up around the porch, and we sat on the plastic beach chairs watching the skies. When we were little, we'd sit outside and Annie would tell me the names of all the constellations and the stories of how they came to be hung up in the night sky. I had to grow up before I realized she had made them all up as she went along. It was a game we still like to play now, making up ridiculous stories for the shapes we could pick out. Ah, yes. That one there is the Coors Light. It got there when God dropped it out of his convertible window and never picked it up, she said, nodding sagely and hiding her smile. Of course, I said, waving my hands and pointing up past the power lines, right next to the ashtray left there by angels on a smoke break. Yeah, they say if you wish on it, all your dreams will come true, said Annie, grinning. She stopped laughing, voice quieter, face tilted up to all those dead stars. Let's wish, Emmy, let's wish. And so we did. The sound of crying interrupted us. It was closer this time and definitely human. We turned to each other confused. Annie shrugged and I squinted out into the black. It sounded like a baby, lost and tired and alone. It must be Mika, I said, slowly getting to my feet. Maybe he walked around the back? Shit, do you want me to call Connie and tell her we'll bring him over? Annie didn't reply and I sighed, rolling my eyes. Guess I'll do everything then. I stepped off the porch, grass soft against my heels. The air smelled like it might rain. Fresh and clean and growing, a promise unfulfilled. Annie's voice was strained. I turned to her smiling. It died on my face when I saw the look on her own. Get inside now. She was staring out into the dark, past me, opening the door with one hand behind her, fingers fumbling on the catch. I froze, barefoot in the dirt. I'd found what she was looking at. In the bushes by the back fence was a person, crouched with their knees tucked up neat under their chin, arms wrapped around legs. Their mouth hung wide, softly opening and closing as he cried. Like a child lost in the dark. Not like a child, but someone pretending. Mimicking the sound opened and closed out in the blackness. Suddenly they straightened, snapping upright face still hidden by the black. They were tall and thin, too thin to be a normal person. Panic made me move. Animal instincts left over from the days we lived up in the trees carrying me forward. I was faster than Annie, dragging her inside and slamming the door behind us, hearing it bounce on its hinges as it locked. We watched as the person slowly walked towards the house, steps deliberate and long. Annie reached for my hand, holding me tight, and turned me to face her, holding my shoulders. Don't turn around, Emmy. Don't turn around. Instinctively, I started to look over my shoulder out into the darkness. Annie grabbed my face hard and shook her head. I knew then she was serious. Her voice cracked and she cleared her throat, gripping my hand tight enough to hurt, nails digging in, grounding herself. I looked down at her fingers interlocked, both of us grown from the same bones. I'm gonna call the cops and everything is going to be... Her voice faltered, stuttering. Tears spilled over her lashes, dripping like a promise of rain. Annie never cried. Your phone's on the porch, she whispered, and bile crawled its way up my throat. Her phone was upstairs, charging. A soft tap, tap, tapping filled the silence. Annie turned to the window, eye whites showing, her eyes were so wide. It was the sound of someone's forehead against the glass, slowly, over and over. They started to speed up, faster and harder, skin meeting glass until they were slamming onto the window hard enough to shake the panes. The tapping stopped and I was about to ask Annie if I could look now when she screamed, followed by the sound of cracking glass and the loudest slam yet. Whoever was in our yard had just smashed their face hard enough into the window to break it. We ran upstairs, 2 at a time, skipping the ones caved in with dry rot on instinct. I turned behind me once Annie yanked my face back before I could see. The sound of broken glass echoed behind us as we made it to the bathroom, locking the door. A thin, wailing cry like a baby calling for its mother filled the hallway, trapped between the walls and locked doors. Annie threw her back against the door, feet jammed up against the bathtub, clutching the knife she had grabbed from the kitchen. I did the same, shoulder to shoulder. Slow footsteps started on the stairs, deliberate and casual. The crying had become mocking, almost laughter. Shrill bursts of sound and then giggles, high-pitched and abruptly stopping before starting again. The first door on the upstairs floor was my bedroom, and we heard the distinct sound of it slamming open. They were looking for us. "What the fuck is going on?" I asked Annie, not even bothering to brush away the tears that I couldn't stop falling. I watched my sister pick herself up off the floor and brace her hands on the door as we heard the sound of a second door slamming open. Mom's room. The next room on the hallway was the bathroom. Annie pulled me to my feet and handed me the knife. I shook my head and pushed it back to her, terrified of what would happen if I had to use it. Annie shoved me and pressed the knife into my hands, thumb pressing hard enough on the blade to bleed. I watched my sister's blood drip down her wrist, a winding red road, still pushing into my hands despite the pain. I took the knife. Something slammed against the wall that Mom's room shared with the bathroom. A high-pitched wail followed. I held my breath, could feel my heartbeat in the base of my throat, a wild and frantic thing. "I'm gonna get the phone from my room." I shook my head violently, about to argue. Annie clamped a hand over my mouth. I could taste the blood on her hand, salty and sweet, like birthday cake by the ocean. "Yes, I'm gonna get my phone, and I'm gonna call the cops, and we're gonna be okay." I shook my head again. "It's the only way. When I go, I need you to lock the door and you don't open it for anything or anyone. Not for me, not for anyone. Promise me." I shook my head and Annie pressed her hand into my mouth, crushing my teeth against my lips so it made my eyes water. "Yes, promise me, Em." Something smashed in the room next door. Annie brushed the hair off my face, gently tucking it behind my ear. "Promise," she mouthed, and unlocked the door as slowly as possible, bolts scraping gently. I watched the curve of her shoulder disappear into the black hall outside, like the moon in eclipse, and then she was gone. I couldn't move or breathe for a second, and then I slammed the bolt shut just as something bounced off the outside of the door. A high-pitched scream followed, handle rattling up and down hard enough to pop one of the screws. I watched it roll towards me on the tiles, and then silence. I sat with my back to the door, holding the knife and wishing I was holding Annie's hand instead. Still silence. Nothing but me and my lungs slowly filling the room with my breath. "Em?" came a voice through the door. I started, hands gripping the knife. "Honey, what's going on?" "Mom?" my voice cracked. "Mama, is that you?" I wrapped my arms around myself, shaking, trying to keep myself still. "Sweetie, it's okay, just open the door. It's okay, just let me in." The handle rattled again, gentler. "Just let me in, it's all okay." She banged on the door and I took my handle off the bolt. "Honey, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I missed your birthday. I'm sorry I'm such a terrible mother, please." Her voice broke and she started to cry. "Just let me in, baby, I'm so sorry." I screwed my eyes shut. She sounded so sad and so lost. I just wanted her to hold me like when I was a kid and I'd come in off the swings with the scraped knee. Maybe this time she meant it. maybe it would all be okay. My hand found its way to the bolt again. My sister's voice came through the door, warm and gentle. "Yeah, Emily, let us in, it's all okay." My hand froze on the bolt and I tightened my grip on the knife. Annie never called me by my full name. A hand banged on the door, handle rattling. "Emily, let us in." Annie's voice became low and guttural, followed by the same shrill giggles from before. Mom spoke now, pleading and crying, voice getting louder and louder. "Let us in. Let us in.
Let us in."
Over and over again, punctuated by her fists on the door. I thought about demons and monsters. All the bedtime stories we prayed don't crawl out from under the bed. "That's not my sister and you're not my mother," I screamed through the door, hands over my head. I climbed into the bathtub and curled in a ball, cradling myself, knife clutched to my chest. I didn't know what it was outside that door, but I knew it wasn't Annie. It wasn't the voice that yelled at when I changed the TV channel, the one that sang me happy birthday, the one that told me I was smart even when I got bad grades, the one that read me stories about princesses that never wake up. It wasn't human. Bangs and yells came from downstairs, followed by footsteps of people running. A low guttural howl ripped through the house, filling the room until it felt like I was drowning in the sound, and then the door was kicked in. I screamed, covering my eyes, waiting to die. Arms found me and lifted me from the tub, carrying me from the room. I looked at the outside of the door as I was carried downstairs. It was covered in long scraping claw marks dragging down to the floor. Pillows ripped apart covered the hallway in soft down, like it had snowed inside. I watched them drift slowly as men in uniforms checked each one of the rooms that looked like they had been torn apart by something feral. Outside in our driveway were police cars and an ambulance. In the middle of it all was Annie, bathed in blue and red light as it washed over her, lit up in the dark like a neon angel, face aglow. I threw myself from the cop's shoulder and ran to her, holding us both together, broken pieces and all. Standing under all those constellations we made up. Gentle screaming came from the ambulance, which rocked occasionally. Annie gently turned my head away, smiling so sadly it made my chest ache as I understood. Turns out there was no demon, no wild animal or bad men trying to break in. Just Mom, out of her mind on booze and drugs and everything in between, coming to the end of a week-long binge. Something had finally broken inside her head, and this time we couldn't put her back together no matter how hard we tried. Sometimes you fall one last time and you never get back up. Annie had seen her in the garden, blood dribbling from her mouth, track marks bulging on her forearms like unmapped roads, rail thin and desperate for one more hit, one more fix. She'd searched the kitchen for all the drink I'd thrown away, and when she hadn't found it, had to come hunt for the stash she hid in the bathroom. She hadn't wanted me, just the drugs on the other side of the door. So high she could mimic Annie's voice almost perfectly. Turns out the real monsters are the ones that eat you alive slowly. The kind that come in a bottle or a needle or at the end of a long list of reasons of why you can't get out of bed in the morning. Sometimes the monsters are the ones that raise you or love you the most, but it's up to you if you let them in. I bought this house 8 months ago to be closer to my son and his mother. His mom and I don't have a great relationship. We hardly speak, but I wanted to be nearby my son in case of an emergency, and driving 2 hours out to this shitty bumble town to pick him up every other week got old real fast. So I bought the house. I thought I got a good deal. 2 bed, 2 bath on a decent amount of land with an old barn and a boarded up well out back. If any of you have been trying to buy a house the past few years, you'll know how competitive it is. In an idiotic attempt to impress the seller, I waived the inspection. never waived the inspection. The house was falling apart, foundation was crumbling, termites in the subfloor, leaky roof, water damage because of the leaky roof. I was hemorrhaging cash just trying to get the place livable, but I was close to my son and the ever-growing to-do list kept me busy, which was nice in a boring country town like this. A few weeks went by and the house became livable enough for me to feel comfortable, allowing Theo, my son, to spend the night in the new house. The time, money, and effort I spent on the shitty little house were all worth it in those short weekends that I had custody. We slid around the hardwood floors in our socks, played hide and seek in the dilapidated barn, and at night we laid in the middle of the giant backyard and stared up the infinite number of stars in the dark rural sky as fireflies floated around us. He loved it, so I loved it. Eventually my to-do list arrived at fill in the well. I mean, what was I going to do with an old dried up well in the backyard? I'm not a farmer and I'm pretty sure the water isn't safe to drink if there's still water in there. The well added nothing but risk. What if Theo fell in while we were playing hide and seek? I approached the well for the first time since buying the house. It sat about 50 yards from the backup from the house behind the old barn. It was a small ring of gray stone that rose about 3 feet out of the earth around it. It was covered with a rotting plywood lid, on top of which stood a pile of dirt and stones to weigh it down. I never should have taken the lid off the damn thing. I pushed the stones off the side and pulled the plywood off the stone opening of the well. I peered over the side and immediately felt a jolt of cold lightning shoot through my body as I saw a shadowy face staring back up at me from the bottom. A moment passed before I realized it was my own face staring back up at me, reflected off of the black water at the bottom of the old well. I had been expecting the well to be dry by how old it looked. I guess it had to be at least 70 years old and the water table should have dropped by now. I took another long look down the well at the black water so far below. I realized I didn't have the tools or know-how to pull this job off and started to back away from the well when a few bubbles floated to the surface of the dark water. I watched as the bubbles dissipated and the surface of the water returned to its smooth mirror-like stillness. A few days after I pulled the lid off that well, my tools went missing. I kept them in the barn out back and couldn't find them when I went out back to grab a handsaw. I chalked that one up to me being a bit too trusting of my new country neighbors. I figured crime wasn't just a city issue after all. I spent what little money I had on some new tools and a padlock for the barn. A few weeks later, the padlock went missing along with my new tools. This time I called the police, who couldn't do much other than to file a report. I couldn't afford new tools, I was barely keeping my head above water with house payments, and I spent most of my savings on home improvements. That's what I get for buying a house when interest rates are through the roof, I guess. The next thing to go missing was my son's bike. We usually left it propped up on the side of the house, but one morning I woke up and it was gone. This really pissed me off. For the next few nights I stayed up late peeking out of windows with my phone in hand ready to call the police. I saw it for the first time a little after 3 a.m. I heard footsteps in my backyard and I crept towards the rear of the house and looked out the window. I saw the black outline of a man obscured by shadow as he slipped into my now unlocked barn. A moment later, I saw him re-emerge from the barn dragging the only tools I had left in there, my shovel and a sledgehammer. I picked up the phone to call 911 when the man did something strange. He walked over to the well and tossed a shovel down the well shaft. I put down the phone and watched the man curiously as he heaved the sledgehammer up over his shoulder, then tossed it down the shaft as well. I stood there watching the man, furious. Getting stolen from is one thing, but for someone to take your things only to destroy them, that was frustrating. Especially since I didn't know anyone in the area. Who would do that to me? I got a hold of my anger and started to dial when I saw the man sit himself on the stone lip of the well, then without warning or hesitation fall backwards into the well shaft. Instinctively, I rushed to help the man, grabbing a flashlight on my way out of the house. I reached the well and called out to the man before shining a beam of light down the deep abyss, only to see the light reflected off of smooth, black water. I phoned the police, who arrived 15 minutes later. I told them the story, and within an hour they had jerry-rigged a ramshackle pulley system and were lowering someone from the rescue team down into the well. I'll spare you the details, but they found nothing. No shovel, no sledgehammer, and no body. In addition to that, I got slapped with a hefty fine for abusing emergency services, but I know what I saw. Thank God Theo wasn't staying with me that night. Things kept going missing. I wasn't sleeping. I'd stay awake for days at a time watching my property, only to eventually doze off. I'd wake up the next morning with my garden hose and wind chimes missing. One morning I woke up to find 2 of the tires had gone missing off of my truck. I lost my job the morning of the truck incident. My performance had been slipping, and me not showing up to work, that day was the final nail in the coffin. As if I wasn't stressed enough. The one thing that kept me sane was Theo. I craved the weekends he stayed with me, but I was even failing in that category. I was too stressed to laugh at his jokes and too tired to play games. Once while playing hide and seek, he told me to sit on the couch and count to 100 before looking for him. I fell asleep before I got to 30. That one ruined the entire weekend. I felt like such a shit dad. I was burning through what little savings I had and decided I need to sell the house. Too bad no one wants an overpriced fixer-upper in this market. Especially not in this town. I was trapped. Felt like I was suffering under the weight of my own life. I tried to live simply. I had a good job. I didn't lavish my son with the gifts he deserved, and still I felt like I was getting priced out of just existing. I made up my mind, no more worrying about the well man. I'd go to sleep early, send out constant stream of resumes from 8 a.m. until 5 p.m., and I would make an effort to make Theo's weekends at my house as much fun as possible for him. I was going to reinvent myself, turn a tragedy into opportunity, take control of my life. I woke up that night to a loud boom. I slowly rose from bed, thinking Theo had just knocked a chair over trying to get to the cookies on top of the fridge, like he had so many times in the past. I sat there at the foot of my bed and took a moment to fully wake up so I could coherently parent. It had been a while since I had gotten a full night of sleep. I was exhausted. I looked at the clock and saw a big red 3:16 shining back at me. I walked out of my bedroom and was confronted by a scene that turned my blood cold. The front door had been kicked in. Splinters of wood were strewn across the living room, and I saw through the open door large, wet footprints that led up to the porch, into the house, and down the hallway into Theo's room. Quickly but silently, I grabbed a kitchen knife and tracked the footprints to Theo's room and pushed the door open. Theo was lying in bed, still asleep but without covers. His blanket was missing along with some of the stuffed animals he usually cuddles with. I quickly retraced the footsteps back outside just in time to see the black silhouette of a man toss an armful of blankets down into the well before jumping in after them. I went back into the house, barricaded the door, put another blanket on my son, and waited for the sun to rise. When Theo's mom came to pick him up the next day, I told her that Theo wouldn't be able to stay with me for a few months. I would be traveling for work, then the house would be getting an extensive remodel, so it wouldn't be safe for him to be here with all the power tools, exposed wires, and nails. She was more than happy to take him away from me and didn't ask any questions. Like I said, we don't have a good relationship. Saying goodbye to Theo was tough, but he didn't understand what was happening. He just asked if we could camp in the barn when he came back. I agreed. My plans to reinvent myself were put on an indefinite hold. I was back to obsessing over the well man. How could I not? He just broke into my home and took the covers off of my sleeping child. Playtime was over. As soon as Theo and his mom pulled out of the driveway, I marched over to the well and covered it with the plywood lid that had previously capped it. I spent 2 full hours searching for large rocks to weigh the lid down with. The lid bowed under a mountain of rocks by the time I was done. With that taken care of, I went to work fixing my front door. I couldn't afford a repairman or any materials, but I managed to get it fixed up well enough to have it be able to lock again, not that it really helped much. Exhausted, I fell asleep early that night. A week passed without an incident. I started a job search, but I was still short on funds, so I started selling off some possessions to help pay the mortgage. My collection of silver dollars was enough to pay the mortgage for a month, but the bills were stacking up. Internet, electricity, gas, trash, water. I sold some kitchen appliances and my Xbox to help pay for those. I walked into town and started passing out my resumes at restaurants and local hardware stores in an attempt to secure some sort of income no matter how meager. I finally landed a gig at a honey-baked ham shop in the back preparing food. $10 an hour for 30 hours a week. It would cover a good portion, but not all of my mortgage. It would have to do. It was back-breaking work, 6 hours a day of carving up ham legs, sawing through femur bones in a blazing hot kitchen, but it bought me time to find another job. I could also sneak some food out every now and then so I wouldn't have to worry about dinner. By the time I got home every night, I was wiped out and covered in meat juice and bone marrow. I'd shower and immediately pass out. I was so tired I didn't even wake up the next time the thing came into my house. I woke up in the morning to again find my front door kicked in and the same watery footsteps charting a path from the front porch and into my living room. This time it took my television. I walked out into the backyard and found the lid I had placed on the wall had been pushed over. I flew into a rage. What was this thing? Was I going crazy? This had to stop. I couldn't just wait for this thing to clean me out. I walked back into town and went to the hardware store where I had just tried to get a job a few days before. I bought a sledgehammer on credit and dragged it all the way back to my house where I took to dismantling the well. I hammered the side of that well with the sledgehammer for nearly 30 minutes before I realized I wasn't making any progress. No matter how hard I hit it, that small circle of stone stayed intact. I couldn't even find a place where I'd chipped one of the stones. Defeated, I dropped the sledgehammer on the ground where I stood and went to get ready for work. The sledgehammer was gone when I woke up the next day. I started getting paranoid again. I felt like a rat in a maze, or more accurately, like Theseus in King Minos' labyrinth. Lost, afraid, and knowing that trapped in here with me is a monster that I'll have to battle in order to survive. I kept grinding at work and I kept selling off more possessions to survive. Golf clubs, microwave, extra linen, love seat, now empty TV stand were all sold to help cover the bills. It wasn't long before the house was nearly empty. I still had a refrigerator, a simple wooden chair, and a few pots and pans. My bedroom consisted wholly of a mattress on the ground with my clean clothes stacked neatly in one corner of the room and my dirty clothes thrown in a pile in another corner. If I didn't get an offer on the house or a better job soon, I'd run out of cash within 2 months. Things were desperate. One night as I lay in bed thinking about how badly I'd fucked up my life, I heard it. Heavy footsteps paced around the outside of my house, accompanied by a low groaning that was barely audible. I sat up in bed and strained my ears to listen. The footsteps circled my small house once, then I heard 2 heavy footfalls on the front porch. It was here. I left my bedroom and stood in the foyer, frying pan in hand, ready to launch an attack at the thing that had ruined my life as soon as it walked in. The wet footfalls continued up the porch and stopped at the front door, which now, due to extensive damage, was not able to lock. I stood in silence and held my breath, having no clue what to expect to see walk through my front door in a matter of seconds. I had seen it before. It had the shape of a man, but I could never see more than its silhouette, and I knew whatever was about to walk in my home was no man. I raised the frying pan above my head in anticipation. The door creaked as it slowly swung open. Standing in my door was a man. He was still silhouetted against the porch light, but it was the best view of him I had seen so far. He was dripping wet and caked with mud. His ghost white skin was swollen and was dotted with large black patches of decomposition. His clothes had deteriorated to rags. His lips and the tips of his fingers were blue as if he was hypothermic. He stared at me with dead, milky eyes. I froze. My plan of attack evaporated before it even started. I was expecting to see something mystical, otherworldly, impossible. But expecting to see something and actually seeing something are two totally different things. You never know how you might react when a dead man walks into your foyer. The dead man took a wet, squishy step into my home, and then another. It was then I finally managed to break free from my stupor and rushed at the dead man with a frying pan. I swung down on the man's head, intending to cave it in. A wet, clammy hand rushed to meet mine and he caught me by the wrist. The man's other hand grabbed me by the throat and lifted me off my feet. That's all I remember. I woke up the next morning with a blinding headache on the floor of the foyer. The door was still wide open. My house was empty. It took everything it could find. No mattress, chair, fridge, clothes, nothing. Even the shower curtain was missing. All I have left is the phone I'm writing this on. I don't even have the charger. That was 3 days ago. Do you know why we throw coins into wishing wells? Ask anyone and you'll get a different answer. Sometimes they'll tell you it's because fairies live there. Sometimes it's a show of respect for the value of the life-giving resource of water. But I know the real reason. It's an offering. Tribute, a payment to keep whatever is down there from crawling back up and taking it from you. I realize this now. Pity it's too late for me to do anything about it. I have nothing left to keep the beast at bay. It's inside my house now. I can see its shadow under the crack of my bedroom door. With any luck, it will just take my phone, but I have a feeling it wants more. It's already taken everything from me. If any of you read this, send a couple prayers up for Theo. I'm sorry we won't get to camp in the barn. A funny thought just came to me. I have life insurance. I'm technically worth more dead than alive.
Goodbye.
2 years ago, my friend went missing from a hotel. I've been looking for her ever since. I'm sharing this because if I don't come back, well, the more people that know what happened, the better. Maybe then, someone will finally believe us. Every year since our college graduation, my best friend Liz and I would go on a vacation together and visit a new city. As we were planning the trip for late summer 2021, she got an email saying she'd earned a free week-long stay at a hotel. She tends to travel a lot for business, so it's not too unusual for her to get a free night every now and then. One of the locations she could redeem it at was somewhere we hadn't been before, and it looked ritzy. It sounded perfect. As soon as we walked into the lobby though, something felt off. I don't know how to explain it other than it had weird vibes. It looked like an old building that had been recently renovated, but the bright colors, lights, paintings, it felt like someone had just slapped a thin, cheery veneer over decades worth of caked on misery. The air just felt heavy. Liz didn't seem to notice it, at least not at first. The guy at the check-in desk stared at us for a while muttering that he needed to talk to his manager. We were a bit worried that we were about to hear that the email she'd received had been a scam, but to our relief, he came back with a grin and said they'd upgraded our room. The city skyline and faint mountains in the distance that we could see from our window won me over. That first day was fine, but when I woke up the next morning, Liz was sitting motionless on her bed, her back to me. "Liz?" I repeated her name several times before finally walking over to tap her on the shoulder. "Hey." She finally turned to me, spoke quietly as if someone else might be listening. "Did you hear it last night?" I shook my head. "Oh." She looked embarrassed for a moment, like she was unsure if she could continue. "I couldn't sleep, not with the scratching behind the wall," she whispered eventually. "I don't like it. I'm a heavy sleeper, a bit too heavy, honestly. At home where it's just me, I have to set multiple alarms to make sure I wake up on time for work, and I've literally slept through a fire alarm once. Luckily, it was a false alarm. Liz was the opposite. Every little noise would wake her, so she always tended to have a rough first night or two as she became accustomed to the new sounds of a place. I thought maybe after a couple of nights she'd get used to it or chalk it up to the building settling, especially in such an old place. I offered to ask for a different room, but she was worried they'd charge us. She said just try and ignore it. The day before we were supposed to check out though, she shook me awake. Her eyes were wide and frantic as she stood over me. She'd moved her nightstand aside and was pointing at a small door, 3 or so feet tall, that had been behind it. The door was old looking, dark wood with an antique knob, and stood in contrast to everything else in the bright and modern looking room. "Did you open it?" She looked at me like I was out of my mind for even asking, and backed away as I approached it, for good measure. I figured that once we looked, we'd both feel better. I was wrong. As I carefully pushed it open, the smell of rust and bleach hit me immediately. The narrow space was long. It went further back than my phone light could reach from where I stood. After a few feet, it faded into blackness. Since it was only as tall and wide as the small door, I realized I'd have to crawl on my hands and knees to see how far it went back. I hate being in the dark and can't stand small spaces, but when I looked over my shoulder at Liz and saw the bags under her eyes, the expression on her face, I figured I'd owed it to her to at least take a look. So I crawled in. Once I was a few feet inside, I saw the small and narrow space ended at another wall, one plastered in yellowing wallpaper. It looked so old, I guess it was probably part of the original hotel. The dark patterned carpet was dotted with stains, which seemed to be contributing to at least part of the strong smell. As I backed out, I thought I heard a faint whisper coming from behind the old wallpaper in front of me. As soon as I was all the way out, I had to fight the urge to slam the door shut and run. It felt so wrong in there. I wasn't sure what the purpose of that space had been, but even then I knew it was nothing good. "Hey," I whispered as soon as the door was closed, as I tried to nonchalantly move the end table back in front of it. "Why don't we pack up? We can find a different hotel for tonight." She seemed a bit calmer and said she could hang in there for the final night. After having been in that small space behind her wall, the thought of sleeping there another night honestly freaked me the hell out. But I figured that if she could make it through the last night, then so could I. After we turned out the lights that night, I remember seeing her dark silhouette sitting on the edge of her bed motionless until I fell asleep. That was the last time I ever saw her. When I woke up, it was almost noon. Both of our alarms were blaring. We were supposed to check out hours earlier. My confusion quickly turned to panic when I realized Liz wasn't in the room. Her suitcase, purse, phone, everything was still there. The main door was locked and chained from the inside too. At first I couldn't think of where else she could be, until it hit me. There was one place I hadn't checked. The nightstand was still in front of the door, but I was fairly certain it was in a slightly different spot than we had left it the day before. Reluctantly, I slid it aside. "Liz?" No answer. She wasn't there. I did see, though, what I thought it had been a wall was open slightly. I pushed it tentatively and took a sharp breath when I saw it led into a tunnel. It went so far back, far beyond the reach of the beam of my phone light. It looked endless. "Liz?" I got no response other than my own voice echoing through the narrow space. I tried to tell myself that it would be okay. I had to go in, especially if Liz had gone in there too. I took a deep breath, nudged the false wall open all the way, and I entered. As I crawled on my hands and knees, my phone ungracefully held between my teeth, I tried to not think about the tight space and the pitch blackness as far as I could see in front of me, or picture what Liz would have been doing down there. I tried to not focus on the streaks of nearly dried blood along the floor. I had to keep going. I knew that Liz would do the same for me. I realized that I wasn't even sure how long she'd been gone for. I promised myself that the walls were not shrinking around me. It was my imagination, and that this dark expanse couldn't go on forever. Eventually, the tight darkness would end. I kept repeating it to myself over and over as a mantra just to keep myself going, to try and distract myself from the feeling of despair that seemed to fill the place. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel ended, opening into a room without lights or windows, but it was at least large enough that I could stand and stretch out my cramped muscles. All I could make out was wall-to-wall dark, crumbling bricks and a weak-looking set of stairs that led above and below. It was so quiet there, so eerie. It was easy to forget that I was in a city packed with people, still inside a bustling hotel. When I shined my light upwards into the pitch blackness above my head, I could see the stairs leading to other platforms like the one I was standing on. It looked like the rooms above and below ours had similar tunnels. The smell of bleach had long been replaced by the scent of mildew and old things. It felt so wrong back there in a way that I couldn't put my finger on, that I couldn't help but shiver when wondering why it had been designed that way, what it had been used for. I assumed the stairs to these tunnels above me led to all the other rooms, so I went down, the protesting metal echoing up into the huge empty space above my head. I finally reached a heavy door, and after being in the dark so long, the bright sunlight hurt my eyes when I opened it. I was looking into the back alley outside around the corner from where the hotel seemed to end. The door was covered with the same bricks as the rest of the building. It was so discreet that when I closed it behind me, it blended in perfectly with the outside wall. I remember running back inside and bracing myself against the counter while I tried to convey what I'd found to anyone that would listen. I still have the image in my mind of how the dried blood on my palm stood out starkly on the white marble. It was all I could focus on as the manager tried to calm me down. He said Liz probably just wandered off. People go off on their own all the time to explore the city, he told me. She'd likely come back later. She never did. I was the one that called the police, and the officer that came out chatted casually with the hotel manager for a long time. They checked the room, I showed him the door, but he didn't seem concerned. He just repeated what the manager said. Maybe she just decided to start over and didn't want to be found. I was hysterical, pointed out that her purse and her phone were still in the room. She hadn't even taken her shoes. It's not uncommon, he told me, leaning in a little too close. A warning less subtle than his words was written across his face. For people to visit a city like this and never leave. I drove around for hours asking shop owners and people if they'd seen her, but none of them had. Eventually I had to go home, back to work. The official story is still that she just left on her own volition. I don't believe it, neither does her family or fiancé. Every so often, he and I would drive up there just on the off chance that anyone had seen her, but we'd always get the same answer. He's the one that had the idea to book the same room again to see what we could find in the tunnels. He must have called a dozen times. He tried to make a reservation, ask if room 347 or any of the ones directly above it are available, and they'd always tell him no. We hadn't lost all hope, but we'd certainly lost most of it, until a few days ago. I recently received an email invite letting me know I'd earned a free week, just like the one Liz received 2 years ago. I went to check in, and after looking me over, the guy manning the desk said he needed to get his manager. The manager, the same one as before, came out in person, and I was so worried he turned me away, but he simply smiled and informed me that my room had been upgraded. I'm sure you can guess my room number. I've been trying to stay awake each night, although after everything that happened, I wouldn't be able to fall asleep here even if I wanted to. Every night I've just been sitting in the dark, listening to the sounds coming from behind that awful door. Sounds that I could almost swear are a bit louder, a bit closer, each night. I'm supposed to check out tomorrow morning. I have a feeling that tonight, I'll finally find out what happened to Liz. Wish me luck. I'm not sure if this counts as alien or not, but I definitely saw something I can't explain at all about 5 years ago. I've been dying to tell the story in a thread. About 5 years ago, me and 2 other friends were on our way back from Warped Tour in Maryland, being driven by one of the friends' mom because none of us had a car we could drive yet. It was almost night. The sun was still kind of out and it wasn't that dark yet. We were driving on a 2-lane highway that had trees on either side of the road and a median in the middle of the lanes. Basically, some creature ran out from the trees on the other side of the highway, jumped the median, and sprinted towards the trees on our side. We almost hit the thing, and our friend's mom had to slam on the brakes and everyone in the car was screaming our heads off. Not because it was a look out for the deer situation, but because this was the scariest looking thing I've ever seen. It was black, had long gangly limbs and moppy black long stringy hair. This thing moved so fucking weird I can see it clearly to this day. It galloped so awkwardly, did not run at all like a deer or anything of that sort. When it jumped off the back of its 2 legs and landed again on the back 2 legs before coming down and galloping across the road. Everyone in the car said the same thing, which was, what was that thing? To this day, I'm convinced it was a demon or an alien or an escaped medical experiment. It was large and terrifying, and the way it moved was unlike anything I've ever seen in my life. I wish I had more details, but sadly that's all I remember. I've asked my friends and that friend's mom about it numerous times years after the fact, and it still gives everyone shivers. This is the craziest UFO phenomena true story, and it came from my dad. 1960s in Ethiopia, my dad is just a child, at 9 years old, at the time playing with his best friend Gabriel after school. They were playing in the fenced backyard of my dad's house. My dad turns his back for a second, then turns to look back at his friend, and Gabriel is gone. It's important to note that my dad and Gabriel were from the top 1% of Ethiopia's ruling elite. My dad's father was a minister of interior of Ethiopia, and Gabriel's father was a 4-star general of Ethiopia. The backyard Gabriel disappeared from had 10-foot brick walls with armed guards patrolling on the outside. A couple hours pass. His parents, my dad's parents, and guards are searching but no Gabriel. 48 hours pass. Now there is a nationwide search for this important general's kid, and it's on the news. Police are searching door to door, describing him what he was wearing when he disappeared. He was wearing his private school uniform, a white shirt, and brown pants. Helicopters even searched the countryside looking for him, but still nothing. A month passes, then 2, and then 4. People start losing hope that he would ever be found and think the worst. Exactly 6 months to the day he disappeared, Gabriel appears back in my dad's backyard. He was wearing the same white shirt, private school uniform, and it was still clean. He looked exactly the same as when he disappeared. This is where it starts to get weird. Once they confirmed that he was okay, they started asking where he had been. He said a couple nice men took him on a trip. He was in a white room that glowed, and the other children were there from different countries. He said he was surprised that the nice men who looked like white guys could speak Ethiopian, and he could understand what the other children were saying even though they were not Ethiopian. The white glowing room had no windows, and the doors disappeared into the walls. There were buttons on the walls, and if a kid pushed them, a bed would come out of the wall. He said he was then all of a sudden in a city that was glowing, clean, and cars were flying around him. He said there was people there, but they looked strange, like us, but different. One nice man was still with him when he took him to the tall building, where he said he had to stay there for a while, but showed him a room that he could use for entertainment. Gabriel said he could push a button and the room itself goes places, an open field, the beach, The room itself even flies. He said after a couple of hours he was taken back to Ethiopia and appeared in the backyard. He thought he was only gone for a couple hours total. No one believed him, and Ethiopia being a super religious country, most adults around him thought he got possessed by the devil. Gabriel even was forced to see a priest to get the evil spirits out of him. My dad still kept in contact with him throughout their lives. Gabriel got a doctorate in physics and I believe works Holland still. Mine happened in the early 2000s. I was around 16. Me, my brother, my friend, and friend's father were catfishing on Lake Okeechobee in Florida. The father had a large pontoon houseboat, so we stayed out there all night. Anyways, the father had went to bed at about 2 a.m. I decided I was going to bed. I laid down for about 5 minutes when my brother and my friend came into the cabin and told me to wake up. I wasn't asleep yet, so I just got up. We walk out on the deck and they both just point out west in the sky. There was this orangish blue ball, kind of floating but moving side to side a bit. We just stared at it for a few minutes. As we kept watching, it would change color. Change from orange to bluish to greenish and back. There was no pattern. It also moved different directions. Finally, after a few minutes, it just hauled ass and was gone. We weren't drinking or doing drugs, but we all saw it. It kind of freaked us out, but it was pretty cool. I have no idea what it was, but it was very strange. It wasn't a helicopter or plane, I do know that. Mine happened probably back in 95 to 96-ish. At the time, I was a pizza delivery guy. I was out on delivery, and after the delivery, I was returning to the store. While driving along the highway, I noticed 3 still lights almost in a row, way off above the horizon. It was evening and dark, and stars were visible. First thought was that they were planes from the airport, as they were way brighter than the stars that were out. They only looked still because I was driving on the highway and my mind was playing tricks on me. Over the course of the next few minutes, as I was continuing down the highway, I noticed the center light started moving up. It continued into the shape of a triangle. I continued to try to keep an eye on a triangle of lights in the distance as the whole thing started moving up in the sky. I eventually lost eyesight of this thing behind the trees and whatever else and made it back to work. Was utterly confused by the whole thing. Didn't tell anyone because I figured they'd think I was crazy. I kinda even thought to myself I was seeing things and making shit up. Don't know why I remember this part. This all happened about a week before the Super Bowl. Might have even been the Friday before Super Bowl. All I remember is that before the Super Bowl I was watching the Sci-Fi Channel. Some show was on about people who had seen UFOs or whatever. I was skeptical at best. Then they did a segment on the numerous sights of triangle-shaped lights, and they started showing clips of the few examples that people had caught on video. It was exactly what I had seen. Never saw anything since, and no one else reported any strange sightings that weekend that I knew of. Of course, I was a dumb early 20s kid, so I didn't pay attention to local news, but I'll never forget that incident. I saw a UFO up close, probably from 30 feet away tops. I'm pretty certain that it was of a military design though. I was out driving with my younger brother near a military base in Tucson, Arizona, probably not even 2 miles from my house. It was about 10 p.m. or so and there were no cars on the road. I was making a left at an intersection, and right as I completed my turn I heard it. Approaching from behind us, literally the sound that they play as an effect for hovercraft in movies. That was what I was hearing. It started out quiet but got louder as the craft got closer. Since it was obviously heading above us, my brother leaned out the window and exclaimed loudly,
"Whoa, it's a fucking UFO."
To which I responded by hitting the brakes. What I saw shocked me and has had me convinced ever since. As I came to a stop, The craft glided above us, and I watched the wings detached like a transformer robot and lower themselves from the craft by about 5 to 10 feet. The wings at this point were supported only by 2 rods connected to the craft. There were 2 giant thrusters on each wing as well, and an even larger one on the bottom of the main body of the craft. The shape and the movements suggested that it was some sort of VTOL mode, because as it changed into this VTOL mode, it swung around and did a complete 180 over a 2-story building just ahead of us to our left, barely missing the roof with its wings, and then it's reconnected the wings, forming a triangular shape, and it boosted off back over our heads at an incredible speed. To further describe the craft, it had 2 modes as far as we could tell. One where the craft is consolidated into a triangular shape and seems to be designed for quick horizontal travel, while the other mode allowed for VTOL movements. It could switch between modes in like 5 seconds or less, and in VTOL mode, it almost looked like the body of a stealth bomber, but with 2 sword-shaped objects underneath it. And of course with thrusters facing at like a 45-degree angle, but they were just adjustable. The whole thing was pitch black, and we would have never noticed it if it had the radio off and heard it approaching from behind. I could come back later with the drawing of it, guys, if you're interested. I got an incredibly good look at it because even though it was late, the craft was flying so low that I could see it via the streetlights. My brother was so scared afterwards he immediately called the cops. Pretty amazing experience all in all. This event occurred in 2011 and has haunted me every day since. I work in networking and all of our hours are late. I usually get off around 2 a.m. and then I'm up for a few hours before I go to bed. This evening I got off work and it was raining really bad on my way home. When I got home, by chance, the clouds broke and I stepped outside to have a quick smoke. One of my buddies called me and we were chatting about work. It was still not raining and there were low-lying clouds. There were orange streetlights in Allen and they were reflecting off the bottom of the clouds, creating artificial light. There was a pretty good breeze whipping around, but no rain. I was facing the west and I look to my right and I see a black cube moving out of the north and traveling south at about 60 to 80 miles per hour. It was moving with a corner forward. This thing was huge. I was astonished to the core of my soul. I sat speechless for a few seconds knowing that I was seeing something amazing. It was 80 to 100 feet tall. It was a black cube in shape and looked like a rough stone surface. On the side of the cube was a border, and within the border was a circular symbol, if that's what it even was. It looked like if you were to draw a circular maze. It was disturbing the air behind it and it created a vaporous trail spinning behind it and then disappearing. There was absolutely no sound. None. If you know Dallas, it was traveling in the direction of southbound 75 Central Expressway towards downtown. I told my buddy what I had seen and he lives a few miles south. I fumbled over my words telling him and asked him to go outside to see if he could see it. Went out to the middle of the street and looked in the direction that it was coming from. After about 5 minutes, it started to rain again. He stood out in the rain for another 15 minutes but never saw it. Good friend. Anyways, no one can ever tell me that I didn't see what I saw that night. I've been ridiculed and laughed at, but I know what I saw. It was almost a relief at this point to know that they really are here. I've been a long-time lurker and I had to get this off my chest. I've been searching Black Cube UFO for years now, every single day. I cannot stop thinking about it. I have to see it again. When I was about 12, my family bought a fishing cabin by a small river about 70 miles from our home. On our first visit to stay in this cabin, it was kind of a work vacation, meaning we were painting and fixing and stuff as well as fishing. One of the people who lived near this cabin came over to say hi and introduce herself. During the course of her visit, she told us, "Don't be afraid of the purple glowing mist you will see. It's just from the UFOs and it won't hurt you." All of us kids snickered at this while elbowing each other, so my mom chased us off, and and apologized to the woman. She later yelled at us for being rude. 2 nights later, we were out night fishing with our dad. The stars were amazing looking without the city lights pollution, and we were all pointing at different constellations and challenging each other to name them. My youngest brother pointed to a perfect circle of about 7 bright stars and asked, "What are those called?" We all kind of froze and stared because, well, there is no such constellation, yet here it was. While we were looking at it, all the stars took off silently in different directions and vanished over all the surrounding horizons. We ran. Looking back, it was stupid to run. I mean, the things were already gone, but we were spooked and we ran as fast as we could back to the cabin where Mom was sleeping. About half the way there, our dad overtook us and ran straight into the cabin ahead of us, slamming the door. When we got in the cabin, he told us, "Just shut up and go to bed." He sounded angry, so we did just that. The next morning at breakfast, when he tried to talk about it, Dad angrily said that he didn't remember any of that and to stop with the stupid stories. My sister asked,
Why did you run then?
He said that he was tired and wanted to go to bed was all. He was tired, so he ran? My dad could be a real goober sometimes. This wasn't the only time we saw things in the sky while staying there, but it was the most interesting. We tried on a few occasions to get pictures, but it was the early 60s and cameras sucked half the time back then. At least the cheap kid cameras we had did. We were afraid to ask to use Dad's good camera for that. We only had that cabin for a few years when my dad suddenly sold it. We never could get him to talk about that night. He would firmly deny it every time we tried. Never did see the purple glowing mist though. We looked for it. This actually occurred last week on January 15, 2016. I live in Outer Sunset in San Francisco and around 7 p.m. poked my head out the window to see if it was raining. It wasn't. I heard a loud aircraft overhead, which was several magnitudes louder than the planes that normally fly in the area from SFO. I looked to my left and saw a plane that appeared to be a commercial aircraft, but I noticed it was much larger and the lights were super bright and creating large cones of light ahead of it. I remember thinking how neat it looked being able to see so much of the craft and area around it lit up with such a cloudy evening. When I tried to focus in on it, the lights flickered off and I lost it completely. I could still hear it very loudly though. About 10 seconds went by and I see something come alight about 2 blocks to my right. I see a lot of commercial aircraft out there, but this was easily 4 to 6 times larger in the sky than they normally appear. The lights were strange too. I saw what appeared to be 4 white jet exhausts, and across the whole craft there were blue and red lights in lines slowly glimmering. It moved much slower than regular planes and was visible for about 10 seconds, moving north along the beach. It then vanished after about 10 seconds. Confused as all hell, I looked around to see if anyone else had witnessed it. Lo and behold, someone on the corner of my street who was riding their bike had stopped and was gazing up at the sky in the same location as the craft had been. I shouted down to them, "Hey, did you see that? What was that?" They turned and looked at me, looked back at the sky, then back at me. Then without saying anything, got on their bike and rode away quickly. I could still hear the craft, so I got onto my roof and about half a minute or so later, saw it come from behind me and slowly fly west out over the ocean until it vanished. I stayed on my roof waiting to catch it again, but I didn't hear or see it. After about 20 minutes, regular aircraft began flying overhead per usual. My best guess was it could have been some sort of military aircraft, or perhaps several in tight formation. Still the loudest and largest aircraft I've ever seen out there. By the way, thanks for nothing, dude on the bike. A couple of years ago, saw two rather large men having an argument in the street in front of my house. After a couple of minutes, they drove off and went their separate ways. I didn't think anything of it until the next day when I get a knock on my door. Turns out that one of my roommates had been sleeping with a married woman, and her husband somehow found out where we lived and was at our house with a shotgun to kill the guy who banged his wife. The dude had a couple of priors that definitely lent the threat of some credibility. The man at the door was his dad, who told me that the argument was him talking his son down. He told me that he showed up as his son was getting out of the car. He asked me if I was the guy in question, and I said I wasn't. He said, "Oh, you're the roommate? He was going to kill you too." Turns out my other roommate had done some things with the young lady as well. The kicker is that I was home alone at the time. Basically, I unknowingly watched a man talk down my future murderer from my dining room window. When I was about 12 to 13 years old, I was waiting for my friends at the entrance to a large park in my city. While I waited, a van pulled up and a guy rolled down his window and asked me, "What are you up to?" To which I replied, "Waiting for my friends," as I paced back and forth slightly away from the van with each step. He said, "Where are they coming from?" And I answered, "From the metro." And he said, "Hop in, I can give you a lift there." Well, at this point I know he's a creeper, so I told him no thanks and began to walk away, while he insisted I accept his lift. I left the park entrance and he pulled into the parking lot, did a U-turn, and drove out of the park along the road I was walking on. Having noticed what he was doing early on, I walked really fast to a hole in the fence of the park and climbed in. From that point, he'd have to do a 8 to 10 minute drive to get back to where I was. Met up with my friends a little bit later and told them the story. One night on my cousin's farm, me, my two cousins, and my two family friends were sitting on hay bales as it got dark, waiting for the coyotes to come out. Me and the two family friends decided it would be funny for one of us to throw a shoe to make some noise and then ditch my cousin on the hay bale. The four of us ran to the barn while my cousin stayed on the hay bales. We stayed in the barn for a good 30 minutes waiting for her to come and find us, but she didn't. We went to go check on her, but she wasn't there. We found her back inside the house. The creepy part was when we talked to her. She asked us which one of us had been running around banging on the fence. We got really confused because we had ran straight for the barn, so we asked her what she meant. Apparently she had seen a person sneaking around with a black sweatshirt on with the hood up and had taken a stick and hit it against the trough and the fence several times. She had thought it was us since we were all wearing black hoodies. We were certain she wasn't lying because she had asked us first and proudly declared it didn't scare her. The next day, while all five of us were out fishing, my uncle said there were two people walking around by the gravel pit near the hay bales who he thought was the two of us. We still don't know who was out there or what they were doing. My significant other was in an accident, which demolished her car. After the accident, we stored the car in our driveway with a tarp covering it until the insurance towed it. She was in Canada for a convention, which left me and the dogs alone at home for the weekend. When I got home from work, I thought it was a good idea to call my parents to catch up. The wind was intense that day and blew the tarp off the passenger side of the car. As I'm speaking with my parents, I decide to pull the tarp back over the car. I'm talking with my parents and listening to them describe their day when I hear a faint voice saying, "Hey." I have no idea where it is coming from until I look down. There's a man sitting in my car. I've never seen this man before, but he looks at me and asks, "Where's Dan and Isaac?" Now, I don't know either of these people, and I told him that I did not. I can see he has all of the personal items from the car in his lap. I start telling him that he needs to get out of the car and leave. Then I see the pepper spray in his hands, which was left by my significant other. I knew at that moment that my day would end with being pepper sprayed, so I tell my parents to call the cops. He steps out of the car asking, "Where's the ice?" I just tell him that he has the wrong place and grab the CD case out of his hands. He reaches for the pepper spray and I back up quick. He stops and says, "I'll be back, bro, just you watch." I watch him walk off, and for a brief moment he starts yelling at a tree down the street. The cops came and he was found up the road, but the officers could not find my stuff. The experience definitely freaked me out for the rest of the night. I worked at a campground over the summer, and I agreed to do security watch on the Tuesday after Labor Day. It's completely empty all day long, and we spend most of the day cleaning and repairing various items in the campground. It was also a family campground with tons of things to do like ziplining, paintballing, go-karting, and hiking. It was relatively large, approximately 50 square acres. Anyways, I'm doing security, which most likely consists of driving around in a golf cart and making sure people aren't doing anything. That night, a motion sensor went off on the upper loop, which had been out of use since July for renovations. Usually when a motion sensor goes off, it's a raccoon or a deer, but we have to check anyways. I make my way up to the motion sensor, which was going off constantly on my way up, and logged it in our notebook. When I got up there was this lady's voice singing in the middle of the night. I walk around and head towards it, which was a bad idea. There was this 40-something meth head in a dress walking around singing. She saw me and chased after me. I ran as fast as I could to the golf cart and took off down to the main office. I called the police, but they were going to be close to an hour. I stayed locked up in the office until they got there. She had paced around the front door and screamed at me the whole time. When they got there, they arrested her and we went up to the same loop where she was to look for more. I swear, looking for more meth heads was more terrifying than being chased by her. She had been living in one of the yurts we had yet to get to for over 2 months. She looked like a witch. The yurt was destroyed and we ended up burning it down. I'm sure most of this thread will be about spooky or paranormal experiences. I've had some sleep paralysis experiences that were creepy, but by far the creepiest experience I've had was just another human being having a straight up lack of boundaries. I was 18, in college, and living with my boyfriend in our first apartment. He had left early for an early class and I had the day off, so I was sleeping in. I awoke to a man I didn't know sitting on the end of my bed staring at me. When he saw me wake up, he said, "It's time to get up now," and just kept looking at me. I was trying to figure out if I was awake or dreaming and if there was anything I could do to avoid getting raped and murdered. He just kept sitting and looking. Figured out I was awake and also remembered that I was sleeping naked, so I didn't want to get up unless he made a move. After what felt like a lifetime of silence, but was probably only a minute, he said it again. "It's time to get up now." I said okay, still too shocked and scared to figure out that I could ask him who he was or tell him to leave, or start screaming for help. He got up and walked out of the room and I heard voices in my kitchen. He left my bedroom door open when he left, so I still didn't want to get up because of the naked thing. After a few minutes, I built up the courage to wrap a blanket around myself, grab some clothes, and dash to the bathroom. As I passed the door, I saw him standing in the kitchen doorway and just staring into my room, watching me run for the bathroom. I got dressed and began to slowly make my way towards my cell phone. I had to pass him again in my kitchen where I could now hear 3 male voices in order to get where it was plugged in. As I passed, I saw that 2 of the men were in plumber outfits and half of my kitchen was soaking wet. Turns out my neighbor upstairs had burst pipe and these men were here to fix it and needed access to the problem pipe through my ceiling. The man sitting on my bed was with the realty company and had let them in. He says they knocked, but I never heard it and no one had called either myself or my boyfriend to say they were coming over. I have no idea why he thought that was an appropriate way to wake me up or why he didn't feel the need to explain who he was or what was going on. Needless to say, we broke our lease and found somewhere else to live after that. A couple of years ago, I went on my first hunting trip. My girlfriend's dad and I arrived around midnight and it was pitch black out there in the country. While he was inside setting up the cabin, I was outside unpacking the truck by myself. All of a sudden, I hear a man's voice from the abandoned barn about 50 feet from me saying, "Come over here. Psst, come over here." I stopped and looked over there. I was pretty much frozen in disbelief. Then he continued, "Hey," I said, "come over here. Come on." And then it stopped. I dropped my stuff, walked calmly into the cabin and asked my girlfriend's dad how close the nearest house is. And I was told it was about half a mile down the road. After I told him what just happened, he didn't seem to believe me, but took his gun out and he kinda just called over to the area, but there was no response. It kinda freaked me out. On a side note, later that night while I was trying to sleep, I heard a loud crash come from the living room and heard him yell,
What the fuck?
So of course I assumed the worst, that the creepy man broke in and was attacking him. I ran out of my room ready for a fight, but found him sitting on a broken heap of wood. Apparently he sat in an old wooden chair and was too heavy, so it broke on him. I had a detached retina at a young age and had to have surgery to repair it. The surgery ended up being around 7 hours long. I remember waking up in the middle of surgery and seeing the reflection off the monitor above me of the medical team working on my eye. I didn't feel any pain, just the complete awareness of the surgery being performed. I remember someone placing their hand firmly on my forehead and saying, "He woke up, prepare another dose." Someone else came into the picture and I went cold again and fell asleep. The creepy part is, each anniversary of the surgery I have night terrors and generally wake up screaming, drenched in sweat. I hate that night because no matter what I do, my body recalls the surgery, and I always wake up dreaming that someone is performing surgery on me, but I am strapped down. I've tried staying up all night when I was 22. I eventually just passed out and had the worst episode where I had sleep paralysis and hallucinated. The surgery was originally supposed to last 4 to 5 hours, but additional work was done and minor complications occurred. The doctors were very good and all still check up on me. I was one of the youngest detached retinas that the team had and get Christmas cards from them still. I don't know why it happens and I can't explain it other than my body just knows. June 17th. I guess it could be similar to phantom leg or something where the body recalls something that isn't there. Tonight is the night. A lot of you have been asking for updates, so here's the plan. Get off work and do some chores around the house. Get the little one to bed and read her 4 stories. Feed my fish, take some painkillers, drink scotch, and play World of Tanks all night on Xbox One. I will update in the morning to see how it goes. I went to bed around 2 a.m. because I couldn't keep my eyes any longer. I woke up around 5:15 with another terrible nightmare. I think it may be a combination of pills and booze, but the dream was replaced with zombies instead of doctors hanging over me. The zombies were clawing at my eye trying to get it out of my head, and I could feel the pressure as they pulled at it. My fiance is a light sleeper and a nurse, so she has that caring mindset, so she woke up. So luckily it didn't last long, as she was gently nudging me to snap out of it, but the bed was soaked in sweat. I didn't sleep the rest of the night and went to watch my fish swim around until everyone woke for Father's Day. A few years ago, my best friend and I went to Adams Morgan, a strip of bars and clubs in DC. It was a Saturday night, so the whole area was packed with people, and we ended up having to park several blocks away in some back alley. As we're walking down the alley, I turn around and notice a man with a backpack several yards behind us. I don't think much of it and we keep walking. A few seconds later, I look behind us again, and now he's a lot closer, so I start speed walking. When I look back again, this man is running at full speed towards us, so I grab my BFF's hand and bolt. We start running full speed down this alley with this guy right behind us and end up running into busy DC traffic, nearly getting hit by multiple cars. It was like a scene out of a movie. We somehow made it across the busy 6-lane street unscathed and watched the man across the street menacingly stare us down before running away, back up the alley. To this day, we still don't know what that was about. And to add, at the time we were two 20-year-old girls. Yes, we did go back to the car about 4 to 5 hours later, but since we ran, we both never saw what street we parked on. We only had a general idea of the area we parked in. We ended up having to use a cab and drove around DC at 3 a.m. for almost an hour looking for my car. We eventually found it, and thank goodness it wasn't broken into. We asked the cab driver to not leave until we got in and drove off. After all of that, we decided to just party in Federal Hill in Baltimore. We never had problems there. When I was 15, I went into town for my first day doing some charity work. I was early, so I sat down on a bench in town center for a bit. Someone approached me, introduced himself, said he just moved there. I briefly introduced myself and we talked a bit about local stuff. He mentioned he was 26, which weirded me out a bit. He was on his phone and suddenly I heard the shutter sound as it faced me. I freaked out and demanded to know why he was taking a photo. He denied it and claimed to be taking a photo of the scenery in a market town with no scenery. Annoyed and creeped out, I just left with no explanation and went to a charity shop where I spent 6 hours working. So 6 hours later, I left the shop and started heading home. Suddenly I heard my name being shouted from behind me. It was the creep again. I said to him to leave me alone, but he wouldn't listen and said he won't let me walk home alone. I was yelling at him, telling him to go away, and I started walking quicker and he kept up. In the end, I just ran for my life and I made it home safely and never saw him again. This happened to me about a month ago in rural Michigan. I was out in a rural area on a big 5,000 acre patch of state land doing some rabbit hunting by myself. I'd been walking for 2 to 3 hours and hadn't seen a damn thing, so I decided to turn around and start making my way back to where I'd parked my car. When I got back to the main trail, I basically had to walk about a mile east and then take a left and head another 2-ish miles north to get to my car. As I'm walking east, I start to get this really uneasy feeling. Everything is a bit quieter than usual. Quiet even for a day with a decent amount of snow on the ground. The eastbound trail before the turn is a lot of small fields off to the side and hills up until a flat final stretch. As I get up to one of the last hills, I look to my left at a field for a second in case I saw any rabbits or coyotes. By the time I turned my head back straight, there was a guy straight in front of me about 100 yards, walking away from me. Something about him didn't settle right with me. He had no hiking, hunting, or camping gear, just a long sleeve shirt and dirty jeans with a beanie hat on. He was walking really strange, not really picking up his feet, just sort of dragging them along, kicking up snow like how a kid would if he was bored. But this was a large grown man. On top of all this was later in the day, almost sundown, and there were no other cars in the area that I'd parked when I got there, which was the only reasonable way into the trail, so no way this guy had driven there suddenly to take a quick hike. I keep walking a little slower, and all of a sudden the guy stops, turns his head halfway, and I can tell he's looking at me. He turns his head back and just bolts running. This startled the shit out of me, and I stopped walking. I know there's something seriously wrong with this guy, so I stopped and swapped out the birdshot in my shotgun to a few buckshot shells I always carried in my backpack just in case. Kept walking forward cautiously, and once I got to the turn in the trail, I looked down the trail, and the guy is nowhere to be seen. The final stretch of the trail goes about 2 miles and is completely flat. There's absolutely no way he could have made it all the way down the trail by the time I got to the spot, even if he was Usain Bolt. I could see in the snow that he was wearing heavy boots. It's a nice trail, but the sides are covered with thick brush and deep forest. So basically now I knew that this guy was hiding off to the side in the brush somewhere. That had to have been the absolute longest, most unsettling walk I've made in my entire life. I tried to stay with his boot trail in the snow to try and get an idea of where he was, but it was lost in old prints from whatever group had hunted the trail that morning. I racked a shell in the shotgun as loud as I possibly could in hopes that he'd hear it, but that didn't really comfort me that much when I was walking near extra heavy thickets on the side of the tall berms where he could have been. Plus, with the snow, it's hard to hear anything moving around. Even once I got to my car, I was really in the middle of nowhere surrounded by more forest. So I kept the gun loaded with me as I got into the car, so I didn't have to unload it in my trunk and be exposed before I got in the car and locked it. That whole walk I just kept repeating the old biblical passage, as I walk through the valley in the shadow of death I shall fear no evil, in my head pretty uncontrollably. Something just felt very, very wrong, and I'm never going hunting there again alone. "3 years ago, I admitted myself into the mental wing of the hospital and was put on 48-hour suicide watch. It was about 3 a.m. when I finally finished giving them all of my belongings and had a temporary cot to sleep on while waiting for a room to open up. Mind you, these cots are only separated by a sheet, and there are several unpredictable people around me who were also being admitted. One of these people was a guy my age, about half a foot taller than me, and had this wild look to him. He reminded me a lot of Gary Busey, which scared the shit out of me. Apparently he'd taken a ton of mushrooms, dropped acid, and went on Everclear drinking binge before the cops were called and brought him in. About an hour after falling asleep from Valium that the nurse gave me, I start waking up out of this semi-lucid, groggy, blurred state to see the dim light above me eclipsed by a figure. I assumed it was a doctor or nurse, but as my vision became clearer, my heart began to pound. The wildly pulled hair, wide open manic eyes, and full-toothed smile was inches above my face. I felt as if I were paralyzed, hoping I could sink deeper into the cot while he raised his hand, crooked and wretched like a claw, closer to me. Within seconds, 2 utterly massive security guards sprinted over, one running so fast that he inadvertently tackled the guy to the floor from having too much momentum to stop himself. That was by far the most terrifying experience I'd ever had. The rest of my time there, however, something else disturbing happened. Our actual rooms had double doors with small glass panes on each one. At night, the doors would close and the security would patrol the hallway. For those 2 nights, I would hear the routine footsteps of the guard as he walked past in his heavy boots. but I also heard and saw something entirely different. I began to notice light, rapid tiptoeing in between each round the guard made in my section of the wing square layout. The guard's boots would pass, but a minute later I would hear, I still wish I didn't look. I wish I would have kept my head buried under the covers in that room. I slowly turned my head and raised the sheet until I could just barely see out of my one eye. As I looked at the door, I noticed nothing but the shine of two eyes staring at me. It was so dark I couldn't see the face behind them, just eyes. After a minute, horrified, they would swiftly go away, giggling and laughing under their breath until I heard a click of the door closing down the hall. Yeah, that creeped me out alright. That was more than enough motivation to seek out a therapist, and thankfully, I've been depression and anxiety free ever since. Paramedic here. We were called at 2 a.m. to a little town in the hills away from our area. Someone had called with chest pain and needed an ambulance. It took us a while to get up there because the road was unsealed and weaved around the mountainside. We drove into the town and there were no lights on at all except for a phone box lit up on the street. The address was actually a little ways out of the other side of the town, about 3 kilometers or so. But when we got to the street, we found no street numbers. It was very hard to see where we were going, but we soon found a shack hidden behind some trees where we think the address was, so we pulled up and knocked on the door. No answer, and so I knocked again. After about a minute, a woman stepped in from the edge of the door all dressed in white, not saying a word, and standing with her nose pressed against the screen and wide-eyed. I asked if she had called for an ambulance and she just shook her head. I asked if anyone else had, and I could see another figure in white standing further back in the house. No lights were turned on and no one said a word, so we got back into the ambulance and kept searching. We drove to the end of the road, which ended in a property with a huge house that had about 30 windows and a yard full of old cars. No lights were on in the house, and we tried to call and radio our communication center, but we were unable to get to them in any way due to the location. We drove back into the town and decided to use the phone booth to call communications about the job. We found a few coins, and feeling a little creeped out, we got a hold of them. They told us they had no further information for us and to have another look around. As directed, we drove back down to the road and had another look. We couldn't find anything matching the house description we were given and even had trouble finding driveways. Finally, we got all the way to the end of the street and looked up into the huge house at the end of the road. This time, a single light was on in the front room, and standing looking out away from us into the darkness was a figure all dressed in black with a huge pointed hood. We waited, terrified, to see if this was the called, and he didn't move despite us doing everything to get his attention. After what seemed like forever, my partner started to scream, and we drove as fast as we could away from the house, up the road, through town, and back down the curling road till we got to the highway. Both of us were shaken by the experience and didn't know what to make of it. Once we arrived back in mobile phone range, we called the communication center to explain that we couldn't find the patient despite further searches. The lady on the other end of the phone explained that they were unable to reach the caller again despite trying, and ended up tracing the call to the phone booth we had called them from in town. I hung up the phone and we both sat silently for the ride home, before my partner asked me if I believed in the devil. I told her I don't know. The following stories involve truckers, road trips, and eerie encounters while on the road. Please leave a comment if you like and hit that subscribe button as it definitely helps out the channel. Not my personal experience, but my uncle lives out deep in rural Oregon. He told me this story where he was driving to work really early in the morning to a small town about 30 minutes away. There was a bit of traffic just outside of town, so he stopped behind another car. There was super heavy fog this morning, like Silent Hill quality, really thick, so he could just see the backlights of the car in front of him. After following the car very slowly for a while, the car stops once more in traffic. My uncle sits there and waits for about 20 minutes. The car still hasn't moved. All he can see is the headlights in front of him. Eventually he gets out to see what's the matter. When my uncle gets out and walks to the car in front of him, he sees the entire front of the car completely totaled. Inside was the dead driver. The back part of the car was completely fine, and my uncle did not even know the thing was wrong earlier due to the fog. The story always unsettled me when I had to drive in the fog. I was once driving late from San Antonio to Houston down I-10, probably about midnight. Along this road there's an access road that runs mostly parallel to the interstate and veers off at an overpass every now and then. When the road veers off, the overpass, which is usually tall enough to let tractor trailers through, has a pretty steep incline of dirt and concrete forming the hill. You know what I'm talking about. Anyway, I'm driving down the road sort of caravanning with my friend, except he was about 10 miles back because he stopped at Buc-ee's to get gas, so he was far behind me. I noticed that there is a car driving at the same speed as me on the access road, veering off at every overpass until I can't see him anymore, and then speeding back up and driving alongside me again and again. First, I'm sort of worried because I think it's a cop. I had a gram with me but hadn't gotten a chance to smoke yet. At one point, the car once again veers off and then back parallel with me until he just takes off going well over 100 miles per hour, I'm sure, because I was already going 75 to 80 miles per hour. An overpass was coming and I expected him to veer off again, except he didn't. He just drove straight on and ramped off the overpass, catching what looked like 15 to 20 feet in the air, not to mention the height of the overpass already. I was still behind him, so I lost sight of him on the other side because I hadn't passed under the overpass yet. But when I did pass under, I didn't see anything. Nothing at all. No wreckage, no fire, no trees, bushes, ditches, nothing. It was like it hadn't happened. I pulled off and turned around and looked around the area and I couldn't find any evidence. It's the weirdest thing I've ever seen. But the weirder part is my friend told me he saw the same car doing the same thing when he got to that stretch of the road, only he never saw the car commit suicide like I did. I had just merged into I-25 from US 36 in Denver, and even though the speed limit is 55 miles per hour, nobody drives that slow. Because of the amount of traffic that merges on at the next on-ramp, I usually moved over one more lane. I did this as usual, and a silver Pontiac Aztek had let me into the lane. I gave them a thank you wave, and just then the pickup in front of me hits his brakes hard, and so do I. The truck then swerved to the right just in time for me to see the cars in front of him stopped. I swerved to the left while still braking without looking. I missed the car in that lane thankfully, but I looked in my mirror and saw the Pontiac Aztek had clipped one of the cars that was stopped. When it did, it spun and then went into the side of the same car. I called 911 and let them know of the accident, then got off the highway at 58th Avenue and came back around as a witness for the police. When I got back to the site, traffic was stopped and someone had already got out to check on people. I didn't see it right away because of where I parked, but when I got out of my truck, there was a guy standing at the driver's side of the Aztek crying, and he had put his jacket over the driver's head. This person was killed from head trauma when their head hit the window. If only I had not been selfish about traffic merging ahead, this person would have had more stopping room and more distance to react. By the way, I'm not a truck driver, but I do drive around Denver and surrounding areas all day for work. Back in the early mid-1970s, my mother and I lived in the Pacific Northwest. I was about 6 years old. We were on an offbeat road right out of Seattle. Very dark night. No moon and a wisp of fog. We saw a Volkswagen Beetle on the side of the road with their emergency flashers on, and a rather good-looking guy, as my mom describes him, with his arm in a sling waving us down. My mom pulled over, being the kind of woman that would help anybody in need, and he looked normal. Mom rolled down her window and asked if she could help, and the guy asked my mom if she could help him get the last lug nut off his tire so he could change his flat. So my mother introduces herself and he said, "Hello, my name is Ted," and then smiled and looked at me, reached over and shook my hand and asked my name. I think I got the bad vibe as well because I said nothing to him. My mom said something about his smile really made her uncomfortable. Then she noticed that he was missing the passenger seat in his Beetle. So she rolls the window back up and said she would call a tow truck to come help him at the next city, and then speeds away. While looking in the rearview mirror, she sees him taking off the sling and getting back in the Beetle and took off very fast in the opposite direction. So that's the night at 6 years old I shook the hand of Ted Bundy. None of these are trucking stories, but they do involve long commutes on country roads. My sis worked about an hour and a half away from my mom's, where she was temporarily staying. At this time, which was bad, because she has a bad habit of falling asleep in cars. So on nights that she worked really late, I made her promise to call me and I'd stay up and talk to her until she got home. One night, late, I'm on the phone with her and out of nowhere she starts screaming. She finally gets out some semblance of a sentence telling me there was a girl covered in blood crawling out of a ditch onto the road. She pulls the car back around and jumps out of the car and runs to her, the phone falling out on the ground. I'm still listening. I hear the girl start sobbing and tell her, "Oh God, not you. Not you. I need help. They're coming back. They're coming back for me." My sister, at this point, thinks this girl might have a mental issue because of how frantic and disconnected her thoughts are. But because while she keeps saying she needs help, she doesn't seem to think my sister could help her. In hindsight, I think the girl saw my 5'9", 100-pound sister with her high-pitched voice and thought that they could easily kill her too. From here, besides screaming and broken glass, I can only tell it from her side. She sees this truck pulling up and is about to wave them down when the girl goes crazy and starts clawing and pleading with my sis to run. The truck puts on its brights and two very big men jump out of the car and start walking towards them, making clicking cat-calling sounds, and my sister's blood turns to ice. She reaches over, grabs the girl, because there's no way in hell she's leaving her, and in a whirlwind manages to force her into the car and jump in herself before the men reach the car and start smashing her lights. She speeds off, clipping one of them, and is followed by this truck trying to run her off the road for about half an hour. They only pull away when she reaches a hospital. Inside, the girl was in a panic and wouldn't let my sister leave her with the doctors. She kept saying she was her best friend and repeating her name over and over. From the doctors, my sister learned that this girl was repeatedly raped and then tied up and dragged behind the truck. To add to the creepiness, once my sister got home, she looked at her name tag and remembered that she had left hers at home and had borrowed an ex-employee's tag, Stephanie. And yet, despite my sis saying she didn't recall ever not fearing for her life enough to get to the formalities and exchange names, the girl had called her by her real name. I was driving a shortcut from 29 Palms, California, to Albuquerque, New Mexico. 29 Palms is located in the desolate high desert east of LA. The shortcut was all two-lane road through total nothingness, except for passing through Amboy, California. Amboy is a nearly abandoned town, nearly as far below sea level as Death Valley, with a dormant volcano and lava field on one side and a salt flat on the other. It was also at the time the hotspot for satanic group activity. So I was driving by myself in the afternoon, stopped in Amboy and snapped a picture of the city sign just to prove I was there with two friends who dared me to take that route to I-40. I got back in my car and proceeded to drive up into the mountain range between Amboy and I-40. Once I reached the top, I am driving north through a canyon with high grass on both sides of the road. Up ahead, I see some stuff in the middle of the road. As I approach, I slow down to see a red Pontiac Fiero stop sideways across both lanes. Suitcase open with clothes scattered everywhere, and two bodies laying face down in the road, a man and a woman. I stop 100 feet or so away, and the hair on the back of my neck is standing up. Being a Marine, I reach under the seat and pull out a 9mm pistol and chamber around. Something seemed very wrong. It looked too perfect, as if it were staged. An ambush? Was I being paranoid? Something was just wrong. Getting out of the car seemed unthinkable. It was the horror movie move. As I scanned the road, I saw a line I could drive. Past the guy on the road on his left, swerve to the right side of the woman, behind the Fiero, and I'd be on the other side. I dropped it into first gear, punched it, and drove the line I planned. I passed the back of the Fiero without hitting it or either of the bodies on the road. I continued forward a couple 100 feet and slowed down so I could breathe and let my heart slow down. As I looked up into the rearview mirror, I saw that the two bodies had gotten up to their knees and 20 or so people emerged from the tall grass on either side of the road by the car and the bodies. At that moment, my right foot smashed the gas pedal to the floor and did not let up until I had to slow down for the I-40 East on-ramp. I will never know what would have happened to me had I gotten out of the car to check on the bodies or stopped my car closer to them. Somehow I do not think it would have been good. Sometimes real life can be scarier than a movie. Mid-90s, I went on a road trip with my son, and for some stupid reason decided to take a different route home than the one I had taken previously and was familiar with. Turned out the new route was a super desolate road. I specifically chose to drive in the middle of the night so my son would be sleeping and there'd be less traffic. It was probably 3 a.m. and of course my POS car breaks down. By some luck of the draw, I'm almost right in front of an abandoned roadside market and was able to coast into the parking lot. The windows are all boarded up on the market. Steam is pouring out from under my hood, and it was essentially the start to every single dumb chick breaks down in the middle of nowhere and gets hacked to death movie you've ever seen. All of a sudden, I see headlights coming around the bend. I'd been driving on this road for a couple of hours and had seen maybe 2 other vehicles the whole time. A truck drives past, slows down, then I see the reverse lights come on in my rearview mirror. Deliverance banjo music starts to play in my head. The truck pulls up so our vehicles are window to window, and I see the driver is an older man, and he's just staring at me. Looks like the stereotypical serial killer you visualize. Long, scraggly gray hair, grizzled stubble, sort of crazy eyes. He motions for me to roll down my window. I'm just trying to look anywhere but directly at him and acting like I don't see him and everything's fine and dandy. Oh no, I'm not in any distress. Please ignore the steam coming from my car. I'm good. Thanks anyway. He backs up a little, parks, and gets out of his truck and starts walking towards my car. I'm thinking this is where my son and I end up on a news story about bodies being found in the boonies when the snow melts, and he starts yelling, "I'm not going to hurt you. Roll down your window." I keep looking anywhere but at him while trying to give off a strong, "you don't want to fuck with me" vibe. In reality, I'm about shitting my pants. He gives me a disgusted look, walks to his truck and starts digging around. He He comes walking back with tools in his hands, and now I'm thinking, oh my god, he's got tools. He's gonna kill me and bust out my teeth and cut my fingers off so I can't be identified. He yells,
Open the hood.
I'm looking everywhere but at him.
Open the hood, let me see what's wrong.
He's pissed. I'm scared shitless, but I reach down and pop the hood. He opens it and I crouch down so I can see him through a couple of inches where the hood is open. He looks up and we make eye contact and I about die. He looks down and keeps doing whatever he's doing. He goes back and forth between his truck and my car a couple times, bringing more tools, some jug of something and other things I can't make out. After about 15 minutes, he closes my hood and yells at me to start it up. My car sputters a little, turns over, and then seems fine. He yells, be careful, there's a lot of weirdos out here. Gets in his truck, gives me one last disgusted look, and drives off. My car made it home. My dad looked it over after I told him the story and deducted the guy had changed a radiator hose. My dad pointed out many times that the chances of me being struck by lightning were probably better than my chances of some random guy in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night happened to be driving around with a radiator hose and the tools to replace it for whatever 10-plus-year-old piece of shit foreign car I'd been driving was. The most disturbing thing that's ever happened to me was on a long drive back to college for my last semester before graduation. I am a night person and was leaving kind of late for the drive but was expecting to get in around midnight. Being that I would be living on my own after school, I was feeling a little bit sentimental as it felt like I was leaving home for the last time. Home was somewhere else now. So it's sunset as I'm driving towards the highway and there's a beautiful low fog in the fields along the road catching the light. I decide around then that it'd be nice to try a far more scenic back roads route than the typical turnpike stuff, so I decided to cut off towards West Virginia. I stop at a diner, get gas, and then proceed towards the WV line as night falls. This is the last human contact I make for the rest of the drive. I didn't foresee it, but an immense dense fog dropped over Appalachia that night, slowing my drive considerably. At some points in the mountains, there was a scarcely 10 or 15 feet visibility, but there are some small towns the road leads me through. It's Friday night, though, and it begins to feel oddly dead in each town I pass through. It'd be 9 or 10 p.m. and the local bars would look closed. There were no lights on in any of the houses. I felt uneasy, but maybe that's just how it is there. Anyway, I'm making terribly slow progress with the fog and the back roads at night. Deer sightings keeping my foot a little light when the fog wasn't too bad. But at some points I'd have nosed my way through foggy intersections unsure if I'd find the other side. It was almost impassably dense at times, and the trip would take double the estimated time to arrive because of it. I'm often driving around 25 miles per hour or worse, trying to be safe. And it's around 1 or 2 a.m., and there's no cell phone service as I get into large national forest. There's no other traffic around, there has been a little all night, so I decide to pull over to pee, leaving the engine on for whatever reason. It'd be a quick stop. I'm not fearless by any means, but I try not to let myself get too jumpy in the woods at night. But as I'm coming around the car undoing my belt, I hear voices, maybe 40 or 50 yards into the forest, and then there's a scrambling through the dead leaves and a brush coming in my direction. It's pitch black, night, no street lights or houses, national forest, cloudy, foggy, starless, moonless night. And I can't see anything off of the road beyond the red glow of the taillights. Feeling sufficiently freaked out and not willing to find out more, I bolt back to the driver's side and floor it up the next hill, happy I had left my car on anyway. My heart is pounding. I never find out more about this little scare, and I'm glad for that. A little while longer, I'm heading up some steep mountains and nearing an old fire watchtower from WW2 days. There's a plaque, roughly, about it being a community morale builder to have built it even if it didn't affect the war in any way. I pulled into the overlook to actually pee because I never got the chance earlier. Now that I'm atop a sizable mountain, I suddenly get cell service and a string of concerned texts from my mom, freaking out asking if I made it okay. By this time I should have been at my house hours ago, but I took a long and unfamiliar way in the dark and intense mist. Knowing that she won't go to sleep until I'm there, because she's like that, I respond that I'm safely home, hoping that it will end it. She immediately calls and asks where I am, and I can't really ignore her call having just texted her. I tell her I'm home, and she asks, "In Virginia?" And I say, "Yeah, in my college town," despite being at the top of a mountain in a national forest in West Virginia. She sounds deeply unsettled and says she's been trying to call me repeatedly while I had no service. I ask why, and she says she got a really weird phone call from West Virginia, but way west of where you should have been, which is where I actually was. She said she got this phone call and a gruff young man in a backwoods sounding voice and was telling her he needed to speak to me and swearing at her and saying all these nasty things. She said she heard people in the background screaming and people laughing. She hung up and called me a few times, but it went straight to voicemail. She typed the number in Google and saw it was from West Virginia and knew I was at least passing through a small part of it and called the number back. Small child answered and swore at her, then the earlier voice ripped the phone back and started saying my name again, saying that he needed to speak to me. This is especially strange because I was driving my dad's car and I'm not registered to it, so even if they saw my plates somewhere and could run them, they'd get his name. I think I even paid with cash at the diner and gas station way back near the start of the 5+ hour drive earlier and in another state. Can't think of anything I could have dropped with my name on it when I'd stepped out of the car briefly earlier during the recent incident. I still had all my cards and my ID. It would be an incredibly strange coincidence or extremely elaborate scare prank either way. I do my best to reassure my mom I have no idea what that could be about and that it must be a weird coincidence. I tell her I'm at my house and I'm okay despite how troubling I found all this in reality. She gives me a half-hearted okay and we say goodnight. Pull out of the watchtower, pull off and continue on to Virginia. Never have I been so comforted by 3 a.m. drags of late-night parties, students stumbling home at a nearby university town off a highway I know well from my usual route. I carry on to that highway and make it safely, and things have been completely normal since. But I have never brought it up with my mom again, nor have I ever had the heart to tell her where I was driving that night, or how late, or of the voices in the woods. There's no climax, no resolution. I'm trying to forget. On my way home from a rather long trip with my mother, we got to a bridge where we saw an elderly woman in a white nightgown. Think Grandma Death Roberta Sparrow from Donnie Darko. It was fall, so rather cool, and the sun was already setting behind the trees, so the white nightgown really showed in the dark. She was just walking. Problem was that she was barefoot and completely clean, like nothing had touched her at all. We had been on this road before the bridge for at least 10 miles, and we had another 15 before we got to anything that even resembled civilization. It's the road and ample trees for miles and miles around. We stopped and asked her where she was going and if she was with anyone. Kept mumbling to herself, but I remember her eyes. Her eyes were wide as if she'd just seen something frightening. The whites of her eyes were bleached white and the pupil was straight jet black. She never made eye contact with us and just kept walking forward. We drove off and called the police. We both kept expecting her car or someone to be on the road ahead, but there was no one at all. Stuff like that doesn't happen at all there, so it was pretty startling to say the least. Very plausible that it was dementia or something along those lines, but once more, walking on foot so many miles deep on this road is just unheard of. If anything, that scared us more. I remember on a long road trip, 14 plus hours with my dad to Colorado. We saw a car barrel past us at like 100 something. Keep in mind it was about 9 o'clock and we were still hours behind schedule and had a long way to go with a short time to get there. Now it isn't odd to see bad speeders on the road, but since we were in the middle of nowhere, we had no idea where this guy came from. We continued driving for a few minutes and saw another car speed past us at about the same speed. Funny thing was, it looked like the same car. Same color, same model SUV. We shrugged it off as a coincidence and continued. About the same amount of time had passed and we saw it again passing us. That time we were very sure it was the same car. This pattern continued twice more before my dad pulled off into a motel to spend the night and delay our trip. My dad is usually a very sensible person that's hard to scare, but I've never seen his face so ashen and afraid. He's never talked to me about the incident since, and doesn't allow me to drive after 9:30. I used to live way out in the middle of nowhere with my aunt and cousin for about 5 years. It can get pretty creepy at night. The town we were closest to only had a pre-K through 12th grade school, post office, church, a tag agency, a notary. We lived about 6 or 7 miles away from and went to school there. Most of the homes are miles apart. We didn't even have bus stops. Each student was picked up at their house. Parents whose children rode the bus had to pay a fee for gas because my bus rides lasted as long as 3 hours every day. That's how rural this area is and covered in woods and rivers. There's lots of wildlife. There had been a wildfire burning in a neighboring county for the past couple of days, destroying acres of forest, forcing wildlife to flee. We had to be extra cautious when driving because deer were everywhere. You couldn't drive long without seeing one. It wasn't uncommon to spot fellow motorists stranded after a deer incident. There was almost always blood-splattered trucks sitting at the gas station. My cousin and I were going home, and we were using her truck to help a friend move a pool table, and we ended up staying and playing pool until a little before 4. We hadn't been drinking or anything, just hanging out. We were driving down this old dirt road. Over the trees in the distance, we could see smoke from the burning wildfire against the night sky. A big buck ran out in front of us, causing my cousin to hit the brakes, and then something much bigger ran out after it and grabbed the deer. It happened so fast and my eyes were locked on the buck, I didn't get a good look at whatever was after it. We hit the ass end of whatever it was and went spinning. The truck crashed into a small ditch on the side of the road, sending dust everywhere. It wasn't very serious and neither of us were hurt, but it knocked the battery cables loose. We both pulled out our cell phones, but of course, no signal. We weren't surprised. Neither of us mentioned what we hit and got out to attempt to open the hood, but we couldn't reach the front to unlock it because the front of the truck was wedged against the dirt and sitting angled downhill. There wasn't much we could do. So we walked up the road searching for a signal and using our phones as flashlights. And then we saw the deer laying beside the road. It'd been gutted. There was a huge ragged hole in its belly, and its intestines were strung out for a few feet in the direction of the woods. This was a very large deer. We immediately decided, fuck this shit, got back in the truck and waited for a passing car. I rationalized that we must have hit the deer or something, but she knew we didn't. We hit something else. We got lucky, and after about only 10 minutes we see headlights. It could sometimes take hours for another car to pass by on these back roads. As soon as they got close, we flagged down the driver and told him what happened. He told us he was heading out for an early morning hunting trip. He wasn't in a rush and offered to try and pull out the truck for us and showed a big dent he had from when he hit the deer a few days before, which started a conversation about all our wildlife animal refugees. We told him about the deer and asked him if he knew what type of animal could do that, and he decided to take a look. We walked him to it, but it wasn't in the same place and it wasn't a whole deer anymore. It had been ripped to shreds. Most of its bones were intact with strips of flesh still attached. It was a horrifying sight, mangled and bent in odd and unsettling ways. He said, "Holy shit, that's a 12-point buck." We asked if he thought a mountain lion could do that kind of damage in 10 minutes, and he replied, "Maybe," very unconvincingly, and suggested just giving us a ride home, coming back for the truck when it's light out. He gave us his number to help pull the truck out later that day, but we had our uncles do it. We didn't want to bother him anymore. There was a bunch of black fur stuck in the grill, but no blood. Our uncles just brushed off the story as an overreaction. They never saw the deer. When I tell this story to people, they always say it was a werewolf or a skinwalker, but F all that. The only logical thing I can think of is a black bear. They don't live in that area, but there are some in the state. They rarely property on deer, but it has happened. Someone could have owned it and it got loose. People have weird pets around here. There's a family pet's kangaroo that got loose and it made front page of the newspaper. Never heard anything about a bear though. When I picture what I saw in my head, it doesn't look like a black bear, but my mind could just be playing tricks on me. It never made any sound at all when we hit it or when it was eating the deer. Nature can get pretty loud out there at night, but we would have heard an animal that big had it made noise. It was all just so bizarre and creepy. Driving through Virginia on the second day of a 4-day road trip, I remarked to my family that it was odd we hadn't seen another RV of our dated make so far this trip. 2 minutes later, one comes along the other way. And then I said, "You know, we haven't seen any deer on this trip. Go around a bend and there's about 6 of them grazing in a glade by the roadside." "Okay. I'm on a roll now." "Okay then, we haven't seen Santa Claus on this trip." It was July. 5 minutes later, there's a billboard with Santa touting the Christmas store. So I said, "We haven't seen $1 million, and that was the end of my lucky streak." I have another story, also driving through Virginia on I-81, different year, same long route. Before I continue, you need to know that in non-Reddit life, I have an unusual name that's hard to spell. I was feeling very depressed about life in general and rather aggravated in specifics. Needed a restroom stop and there aren't many along that stretch. And my dear, dear husband has an amazing ability to pull into the grodiest gas stations. True to form, the one he pulled into took the cake. No name brand gas, filthy dirty, but I was ready to take what I could get. I head into the restroom stall. Weirdly, it had only one graffiti on the wall saying, "God loves," and my name. Spelled correctly. Nobody, except God apparently, ever spells it correctly. Even some family members. I took a picture and laughed the entire rest of the trip. That was a funny one. Around 95 to 97, I was driving to Michigan to visit family. I live in Kentucky. I normally like to drive on long distance trips like that during the midnight hours because there's less traffic. Passengers usually sleep, which makes for longer hauls in between stops. And quite frankly, I don't like dealing with other people and drivers. There was one big stretch of the road going up through Ohio, or maybe Indiana. Can't exactly remember. I was going fine and nothing out of the ordinary. I then start noticing a bright light up ahead. I wasn't sure if it was another vehicle or a gas station, but I thought it seemed a lot brighter than usual. As I kept driving, I could tell it was moving and was getting bigger and bigger. I wake my cousin and tell him to check it out. We're both staring as it is clearly moving closer and becoming more brighter and more larger with every passing second. Then suddenly, it seemed as if it instantaneously just flew directly over our heads and felt as if it was only a few feet above the car. It never made a sound but was moving ridiculously fast, and for lack of a better description, was just like a bright white ball of fire. I watched it move out of the distance through my rearview mirror. Hands down the craziest thing I've ever seen in my life. My friend and myself were on a road trip. Part of the road trip took us just north of San Francisco and just south of the area where the Zodiac was supposed to live. For some reason, our mapping program freaked out and took us on a long way back to our campsite. The road runs through the mountains and is 1.5 lanes wide, meaning that if there's another car coming at you on one of the tight curves, one of you will have to stop, reverse to a slightly wider point, and let the other car pass. Sure enough, we get to talking about the Zodiac, you know, college kids trying to freak each other out. This was a long time ago, but we'd be doing the same thing if it were today. On cue, we run into another car. It doesn't turn its high beams off, blinding us. We kidded each other that it was the Zodiac, blinding us so that he could take us out before we knew what was happening. I reverse to let the car pass. He drives by. It was just a harmless man with his kids in the back. Then I see a flash out of the corner of my eye. I look over at my friend to ask if he saw it too, and he was open-mouthed staring in the same direction. Today we have no idea if it was our minds playing tricks or not, but he got a much better look than I did. Both of us swear we saw a man running off through the forest wearing what? A dark blue jacket. We both figured we were just seeing things, but neither of us ever fully gave it up to a creation of our mind. When I was 19, my best friend and I, he's a guy and I'm a girl, road tripped around the west coast for a few weeks of the summer. When we hit Humboldt, we set up camp in a state park, then decided to cruise back to town to get some pizza and see if we could spot anyone who looked like they could sell us some bud. After dinner, finding no one and feeling like dorks, we started driving back and, on an exit ramp, spotted a woman with her thumb out. She was so nondescript it was impossible to get a read on her. Somewhere between the ages of 25 to 35. Straight brown hair, brown pants, and a plain blue sweater. Possibly because we were bummed out that the afternoon was ending without any memorable pot-buying shenanigans, we picked her up. She said her name was Trish. She had these very hollow eyes. She spoke very quietly. She carried a small brown leather suitcase, and she asked where we were going. We told her. We asked her where she was headed, and she said, "Oh, I think I'll get a ride into the park with you. I won't sleep in your tent or anything," she assured us. We had a 2-person tent and obviously didn't want a stranger in it with us. We couldn't offer that, it was awkward. We had leftover pizza in the back seat, told her to help herself. She ate it all, quickly and quietly, like she hadn't eaten all day. Get to the campsite. Awkward. She asks what time we're leaving in the morning. We tell her 10. She nods and says she will see us then, turns and walks into the woods. Disappears. We go to bed, no idea where she is or if she's coming back. In the morning she appears minutes after we get up and start moving around, making oatmeal on the camp stove. She does not look as if she spent a sleepless night in the woods. She looks exactly the same, not a hair out of place, not a pine needle stuck to her sweater. She observes our oatmeal, then disappears again. She returns shortly with 2 hands full of blackberries. This is a crowded campsite and the blackberry bushes are picked clean. My friend and I spent a good half hour foraging the day before and found 3 berries total. We put the berries in the oatmeal and we all eat. We pack up, get in the car, ask where she wants us to drop her off. She tells us to take her back to the very spot where we picked her up. It's not the direction we're going, but it's not far. She looks very sad. She thanks us and she gets out. We wish her well and she says something like, "I doubt it." There was something spooky about the whole thing, but more than that, it was just really sad. I drive a pretty decent stretch of back roads between my home and my university quite frequently. It's like an hour and a half of nothing but farms and trees. Late at night, on a particular desolate stretch of road, I noticed some flickering lights way ahead of me. As I sped closer, the lights grew more intense until it was pretty bright glowing. When I was close enough to see what was going on, I saw a bunch of cars and trucks parked off to the side of the road, and a huge fire burning in the trees about 30 meters from the road. I stopped, checking out the amazing bonfire. The stack of trees and logs was like 10 or 15 feet high, and the flames were easily double that. The fire was so bright that it was hard to look at for longer than a couple of seconds, but I could see people moving around just inside the trees. They were packing up chairs and tents and running back and forth between their camp and vehicles, obviously bailing. A mammoth of a man got out of one of the trucks and started waving his hands at me. I tensed up, wondering if I'd stumbled upon the wrong kind of party, but the guy just told me it would be best to move on as the fire was likely to spread. I realized that the fire had probably started out much smaller and burned out of control. Later that week, on my way back, a huge swath of woods had burned down. There was still fire and rescue milling around, but it looked as if the flames were all the way out. I still don't know if the people I had seen were caught or owned up to starting a forest fire. Luckily, it hadn't spread for more than a few hundred square feet before it was extinguished. Not a trucker, but once went on a trip to Dallas with my mother. Not sure where we were exactly. It was about midday though. Traffic was almost stopped on the freeway, and I was looking at one of those pedestrian overpasses. You know, the ones that are fenced on the sides and are just for people to walk over. I noticed it from a distance, and it looked like someone was standing on it, dressed in white. As we got closer, I realized that whoever it was had been duct taped to the fence with his arms out at his sides like he was crucified. He looked black, maybe Middle Eastern, with a white robe and white turban. A black bag sat next to him on the concrete. We stopped a few feet from the bridge because traffic wasn't moving, and I'm fairly certain it wasn't a mannequin, but if it was a damn good one. My mother looked just as freaked out as I did, and I kept glancing back at it as we drove off. One night about 6 months ago, I was driving my sister home, and to get to her house I have to drive 15 miles highway and 6 miles back roads. It's 1 in the morning and I had just dropped her off when I'm at a stop sign waiting to turn out. I see the first set of headlights I had seen since leaving my house. I didn't think anything of it and got on the highway. This is where it got messed up. There are no lights on this highway, just country and the glow of headlights. The dude pulls up right beside me like he's going to pass but just drives alongside me. I speed up, he speeds up. I had finally had enough and rolled my window down and gave him the finger, but I'm shocked at what I see when I roll down my window to look over. It's a guy. All the lights on his old box van, with his eyes open so wide and his mouth open as wide as it can with all of his teeth showing, and he had an old Polaroid instant camera. He kept taking pictures of me because I literally couldn't get away. I finally slammed on my brakes and he kept driving, and I got his license plate number and reported it, but the cops just chalked it up to kids playing pranks. Yeah, right. I'll go for one that we just couldn't explain. I was riding shotgun in a car with my ex and her sister on a stretch of road with only marshland and forest around in pouring rain. I remember so clearly being asked if I liked INXS, and I said I didn't really listen to them, but to go ahead because I always liked finding new music, so she put them on. I think we were driving really far to get to a mall or something, I can't really remember. Coming down a hill, we saw a man walking towards us, kind of off to the passenger side of our lane, bawling his head off. He had a briefcase above his head to shield him and was dressed in a full nice suit. As we got closer, I noticed that instead of a dress shirt, he had an INXS shirt tucked into his dress pants. He was older and not homeless. I got the impression of a rich man. We just drove by and nobody but me noticed the shirt. Just commented on how weird it was a guy was just in the middle of nowhere, but I thought that was really freaky. We didn't see any breakdowns or somewhere he could have came from for an hour in either direction. Also, he was dry. Thinking back to it, he wasn't wet either. He would have been muddy all over out in that storm, but he was very much dry. Once my friends and I were driving back from the nearest decent-sized city to our crappy little hometown in rural Tennessee. Now, I had an older car, but it was in fairly good shape. No real issues aside from some carburetor problems occasionally. There were probably 4 or 5 of us in the car. One of my friends had recently read some novel where a character says, well, Jesus, Buddha, and a bag of chips. Being wise-ass teenagers, we thought it was hilarious for some reason. We kept coming up with various combinations of blasphemous words in the same vein as the original. After a few minutes of this, suddenly all the lights in the car just cut off, inside and outside. Nothing else was affected, just the lights. Then just as suddenly, they came back on. Obviously, we chalked this up to chance. I had never had that happen in my car before, but it's not something that can't be reasonably explained. After a few minutes of nervous laughter, the blasphemy resumed. Again, the lights shut off, and now I was worried. I thought something was really wrong with the car. My friends accused me of turning off the lights. I hadn't, and convinced them of it. Again, the lights came back on. Now, I'm an atheist currently, and at that time was a pretty cynical Christian. I didn't put much faith in the thought that our banter was pissing God off, so he was sending a message. But still, sometimes you don't tempt faith, right? Well, you aren't me then. Much to the dismay of my friends, I decided to give it one more try. I don't remember the exact phrase, but let's assume it wasn't something you'd say to your grandmother. No sooner had the last syllable rolled off my tongue than the lights cut off for good. This time long enough to force me to pull over and turn off the car. We all sat silently, pondering what had just happened. One of my more religious friends said a little prayer in the back seat. I kept my cynical mouth shut this time. Eventually I started the car and the lights came on just like normal. We rode the rest of the way home in silence. I never had a problem with anything electrical in that car after that night. The battery even lasted a couple more years until I sold it. Not a truck driver, but it happened on an early morning vacation drive. My wife and I were traveling on I-40 from Oklahoma to Ohio, stopping in Tennessee to see some family. We left at midnight, something we hadn't done on a road trip before. As we're in Arkansas, we're winding through a hilly area. It all happened quite fast as we were probably traveling around 70 miles per hour. I swear I saw a Wolfman type creature. I say wolf as it appeared to be a large dog-shaped thing with a pointed snout, and I say man because it was running across the road on 2 legs. It moved right to left, and time seemed to slow down as I barely missed hitting him with my car as I passed him on the driver's side. I looked over at my wife and she looked at me, wondering what the hell we just saw. Was it just too early in the morning? It was about 6 hours into the trip, sunlight barely coming out over the hills. We haven't spoken this to anyone, with assumptions of no one believing us, but this is Reddit. What the hell? Not a trucker, and my story isn't spooky as such, but it was plenty scary to me. This is about the night I spent in a jungle that is home to tigers. I was born and raised in India. Happened almost 30 years ago. I had just turned 18. My dad gave me a new motorbike. It was my summer break. I decided to take a road trip up into the Himalayan foothills. The Himalayan foothills are part of the Terai forests, huge hills which could be called mountains if they weren't sitting next to the Himalayas, densely forested. And I don't mean gentle European forest, I mean tropical jungle. You need ropes and machetes to get through parts. I was exploring an area where 3 of these mountain ranges intersect. The Melani, Chilkia, and Dima ranges, part of which happen to lie inside the Corbett National Park, which is one of the tiger preserves of northern India. It's not just tigers. The same forests also have leopards, wild elephants, bears, jackals and hyenas, monkeys, and huge pythons that kill and eat deer, and crocodiles along the Kosi and Ramganga rivers below. So one evening I rode my bike up a little dirt track on the hillside to get to a little promontory up there for a better view. Sat down to enjoy the view and smoke a cigarette, and while I was doing that, my bike slipped the kickstand on the uneven ground and went sliding down into a ditch about 15 feet deep. That's how I ended up spending the night in the jungle. I had left it late in the day with only a couple hours of light left because of the forest lodge where I planned to spend the night that wasn't too far. But without the bike, there was absolutely no chance of getting anywhere. I used what daylight was left to trek down the hill and get back to the main road on the off chance that someone driving by might help me. But it was a slim hope. The road is actually a dirt track and there's no traffic on it after dark. So imagine this. This road was about 15 to 20 feet wide. On both sides, the land had been cleared for another 50-ish feet. Beyond that was jungle. You actually can't see past the first couple rows of trees. It's too dense. For the first few hours after sunset, there was a thin crescent moon, but around midnight even that set, and then it was pitch dark for the rest of the night. I sat down in the middle of the road, trying to keep as far as I could from the jungle on both sides. I had a tiny flashlight, useless beyond half a dozen feet. Had my cigarette lighter, but no dry wood to make a fire. First few rains of the monsoon had already come and everything was damp. I didn't dare go into the jungle to search for dry wood. I couldn't see a damn thing, but I could hear the noises. Goddamn, the jungle is loud and scary at night. All sorts of birds and animals calling, squeaking, grunting, rustling. Twice that night I heard tigers call. Fortunately, they seemed far away. At least half a dozen times that night I heard langurs giving their alarm cries. These are monkeys, and they have an early warning system of cries and calls to warn each other of danger. Leopards find them tasty. So every time they call, it's a shock to the system. Is there a leopard hunting them nearby? Or a big python? Or are the buggers just confused or cranky? Who knows? You can't see anything beyond a few feet anyway. But big cats have much better night vision than I do, and could probably see me if they came close and smell me from much farther away. That felt like the longest night I've spent in my life. I was too scared to sleep. In the morning, a jeep with a forest guard drove by. He heard my story, then went back and sent a few villagers to help. They dragged my bike out from the ditch with ropes and I went on my way. But I'm not going to forget that night in the jungle. Not a trucker, but in the late 90s I took a day trip over to Naples, Florida, with a friend of mine who was interviewing with their fire department and asked me if I would accompany him. We had been traveling down Alligator Alley for several hours when we passed what appeared to be several dozen white shirts hanging in the cypress trees on the opposite side of the road. Intrigued by this, we made a note of their location, and on the return trip later that afternoon made it a point to pull over and take a closer look. It was pretty weird. Someone had taken about 30 identical white pressed dress shirts and hung them at various heights throughout the cypress trees, which were standing in at least 4 feet of stagnant swamp water. The shirts were being held up in the trees by some kind of makeshift hanger composed of sticks, rather giving it a Blair Witch feel. While a few of the shirts had picked up some dirt, it was clear that at some point they had been bleached white and starched thoroughly, At one point, my friend tossed a rock at one and it bounced off with a loud thud. We stood there looking at this display with a growing sense of unease, wondering what it meant and who had taken the trouble to travel out in the middle of nowhere to wade out into several feet of gator-infested waters to hang shirts in trees. In the waning hours of daylight, it seemed even creepier. Between the eeriness factor and the mosquitoes, we decided to return to the car and drove off discussing our finding. We decided it was perhaps some kind of memorial to someone killed on the road, or perhaps something more sinister like a ritual of some sort. Through the years, I have read other reports of similar displays being sighted on other remote roadways throughout the country. A few years ago, I happened to be traveling on Alligator Alley again and did not notice the display. Wish we had been able to get a picture of it. For the sake of privacy, I'm going to call myself Howard. A few years ago, I'd say this would have been around late 2018, so I was about 13. Me, my mom, my stepdad, and my grandmother all spend the weekend at my mom's friend's house, which sits about a mile off the coast of Lake Huron in northern Michigan. I was extremely nervous since my mom told me it was a heavily forested area. I was scared of the wolves and or bears that live up there, and I love forests, just not the things that live in them. I kept telling my family I don't want to go, there could be something in the woods there. Either my mom or my stepdad would try to comfort me by saying something like, "It'll be fine, if anything happens, we'll protect you." Or, "There's a lot of us, nothing would be brave enough to fight us," which kind of helped because turned out there would have been a lot of people there. 7 people and the 4 of us. It was about 5 p.m. and we left our house in the southern regions of Michigan, and it was about 8 p.m. when we arrived. It was the lake house in the outskirts of Bay City. When we got there, I was reminded of my fear from earlier. The house sat in a large clearing and was surrounded by miles of forest on all sides. I got a sense of dread at the sight, but I tried to ignore it. I met the friends and they were pretty nice. I got pizza from the local pizza place and I mostly forgot about the forest. I was sitting in the kitchen watching YouTube on my phone. They were all hanging out in the basement where there was a TV, a pool table, and all sorts of cool stuff. It was just after 11 p.m. when I heard something scraping up against the wall outside on the other side of the stove. I was sitting a good 10 feet from the said stove. For perspective, the main floor sat about 5 feet off the ground, and there were stairs that led up to a small porch. I noticed the sound when the video I was watching ended. It sounded like multiple shard things scraping against the wall. I was too scared to look for the cause of the sound. Suddenly the sound stopped and it walked into the backyard. It was a deer. I was immediately relieved as I was taught deer were a symbol of peace and freedom, so I smiled as it pranced into the forest beyond the backyard. My mom asked if I was okay, saying I still looked spooked. I told her the truth. I heard scraping outside, but it was just a deer. She chuckled. "Oh yeah, I've heard their antlers scraping against stuff so many times, and it startles me every time." Then she told me they were all going to bed, and so did I. I went to the bed on the couch in the living room, and I brought my Jurassic World blanket. I slept rather well despite my fear of the surroundings. The woman, my mom's best friend at the time, the person she came to see specifically, who for the sake of privacy we'll call Carissa, woke me up saying, "Hey Howard, wake up buddy, it's bright outside." I got up rather quick since I still didn't fully trust the place. I checked my phone and it was somehow 2 p.m. I guess I slept in. I went outside and they had a cute husky named Blitz. I played with him for at least 2 hours. He was super playful. He had a soccer ball he liked fetching, so I made him fetch the ball for a while. We then went to the lake, all 10 of us, but I didn't want to go. I'm not a social person, but my mom gave me no choice. One of my worst fears came true. When we got to the beach, the friends had their own friends who had kids. Before I continue, I want to preface this by saying I don't like kids, especially little kids. That's exactly what they were, 3 little kids. I don't remember how old they were, but they were young, no more than 6. Little kids annoy the hell out of me. I had a cousin in my home state in Tennessee that was half my age, so I know how little kids are. I brought my phone and I just sat just beyond the tree line. The woods were right across from the beach, just a few dozen yards. I was okay with this patch of forest. It was bright as hell and there were so many people there, so I felt safe. And I watched YouTube again. I was sitting there for a good hour and a half, and the minutes that followed was when the strangeness reared its head. I remember every detail of those moments. I was watching the Hodge twins, specifically their video where they read an email from a guy who asked if he should go back to his ex-girlfriend. I was quietly laughing, but my laughter was quickly killed by something deeper in the forest. I heard what sounded like my grandmother calling to me from a few hundred feet away. I was about to get up and follow her voice when I stopped myself because I remembered she was sitting next to my mom on the beach. I could see her in the opposite direction of the voice. The voice sounded slightly off, like my grandmother was out of breath. I could hear her saying something vaguely that sounded like, "Howard, come here, boy," which is something she always says when she needed me. She'd be calling me boy. I noped the hell out of there and went back to my grandmother and sat in the empty chair next to her and told her, "I heard someone calling me in the woods and they had your voice." Her and my mom looked me in confusion and my mom said, "They sounded like her?" And I explained, "The voice sounded like grandma does when she's out of breath, like when she climbs the stairs to her apartment, exactly the same." They both looked at me like I was an idiot. They said I was making it up and I was trying to just go home, which made no sense to me. Still doesn't make sense. I spent the next 5 minutes insisting that it was true, but they kept saying I was making excuses. But I knew better. I knew exactly what I heard. I sat next to them for the rest of our time at the beach. About an hour later, we headed back to the house. Carissa's friends came with us, the couple with the 3 kids. 5 of us rode in one vehicle, and the others rode in another vehicle. I rode with the people I knew. It was pretty dark by that point, not pitch black, but you still would have needed light to see. We were surrounded by forest for a good minute of the drive back. The tree line was maybe 6 feet away from each side of the van. For the moment we were surrounded by woods, and I could have sworn I saw a dark figure running with us just beyond the tree line, but I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. It was about a 5-minute drive from the beach to the house. When we got there, the kids raced into the house, playing, being loud and rambunctious and all, and I waited for my mom to go inside before I did, to avoid as much interaction with the kids as possible. Once we all settled in, the parents of the kids told me I should play with the kids, since I was a kid too, but I didn't know what to do, so they guided me outside with the 3 little shits, then told us we could play with Blitz. I approached the dog with the kids behind me, and I crouched down and started to pet Blitz. He was really friendly and clearly seemed to enjoy it. He rolled over on his side, wanting me to rub his belly, and so I did. After a minute or 2 of petting him, I grabbed the ball and gestured him to play, but he didn't move. I figured he was too tired. Then when out of nowhere, the oldest of the kids said, "Hey, you stupid dog," and kicked Blitz in the ass. Pretty hard too, clearly annoyed with him for not playing. The dog barked angrily, quickly got up and tried to pounce the boy, but I grabbed Blitz's collar before he could do anything, and the family ran out to see the commotion, and Carissa came to calm the dog down, and the kid was crying his eyes out. I went over to my mom as she asked what happened. I told her the kid kicked Blitz for not wanting to play, and Blitz wasn't having any of it. I told her the kid deserved it, and it seemed like she somewhat agreed with me, saying, "Well, he shouldn't hurt animals like that, or that's gonna happen." They all went back inside, taking the kids with them, and Carissa was mad at the dog for simply protecting himself. I sat next to him and continued petting him, this time for a solid 5 minutes, praising him, calling him a good boy, since it was the kid's fault for being an asshole. I then heard a stick break in the woods about 100 yards away, but it sounded less like a stick and more like a branch being crushed. As soon as I heard the sound, Blitz shot up and stared in the direction of the sound. He got up and sniffed the air and started growling. His fur stood up at a cartoonish level and he was baring his teeth. He scooched next to me, clearly trying to protect me from whatever was over there, and whatever it was clearly a threat. He started barking again, but this time, the barks were out of pure anger. His barks sounded primal. I stood there trying to adjust my eyes to the darkness, trying to see something. My heart was pounding. I thought it was going to explode. Suddenly, Blitz took off into the forest after whatever was there, completely ripping out his tie-out stake. I ran into the house and told everyone that Blitz ran after something in the woods and I couldn't stop him. Then Carissa's husband, I'll call him Steve, and my stepdad. Steve grabbed his rifle from their room and sprinted out the door, followed by my stepdad who got his pistol from the basement as he brought it with him, and they both charged into the woods. They were very fit guys, so I figured they could either shoot or beat up whatever was out there. I thought it was a person or maybe a bear or wolf that was out there. We turned off all the lights in the house, opened the window that faced the direction they went, and we sat there for a good 5 minutes or more. We saw and heard nothing. Another 5 minutes, nothing. After a few more minutes, we heard very faint gunshots coming from the woods. It sounded like he was quite far away. They must have been a mile away by now. Carissa wanted to go out there and look for him, but Steve ordered we stay inside no matter what happens, and my mom reminded her of that. We stayed up for a few hours hoping they would come back at some point, but they didn't. We hesitantly went to bed and I could hear Carissa bawling her eyes out in the basement. I slept on the couch again and I made sure the curtains were closed just in case the stranger returns. I took about 20 minutes to fall asleep, so I decided to listen to some ASMR, specifically Goodnight Moon. If nothing else could bring me comfort, then she can. I woke up early the next morning. I checked my phone and it was 9 a.m. The sun was shining through the cracks of the same, and everyone was still asleep. I got up and let out a big stretch before walking over to the back porch. I opened the curtains and what I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. I saw Steve and my stepdad, or what was left of them. Whatever that thing was last night, whatever they and the dog went after, it tore them apart. I could barely recognize them. That's how mutilated they were. My stepdad was missing his lower half. His inside were sprawled out all over the place. Steve's throat was torn out, his legs missing, and his chest was torn open. He had huge claw marks all over his body. They both looked like parts of them were eaten by something big. I noticed all of this in the split second that I was staring, and out of shock and disgust, I blurted out, "What the fuck?" at the top of my lungs. That woke up everyone and they all came running up the stairs. It felt like a stampede with all the people running. They all saw the horrifying scene. That moment, everyone started screaming and crying. My mom and Carissa both ran to theirs and held the two men. The mother of the kids kept them back so they couldn't see the death, and her husband called 911. After 10 minutes or so of panic, the cops arrived and we showed them the gruesome scene, and they both gagged and nearly vomited at the sight. They called for the chief and the medical professionals to take care of the bodies. My mom and Carissa sat there next to the bodies, absolutely devastated, crying a river until the paramedics arrived, who then took the bodies away. The cops stayed and questioned us. I didn't hear what the cops asked them, but after some time they started to question me, and since I'm a kid, they took their down stern tone a few notches, and they asked me questions like, "How did you discover the bodies? What happened the night before? And did you hear anything through the night?" And of course I answered truthfully. After questioning everyone, they left and we all sat there in dismay. My mom broke the silence by saying, "What could have done that?" And I told her, no animal could do something like that. My grandmother asked, "Why would the thing leave them there? Is it taunting us?" And after a few minutes of discussion, we decided to Google things like biggest animals in Michigan, bear claw marks, deaths in Bay County, and turns out there were quite a few missing persons reports in the area, and the victims were either found dead, found alive but injured, or never found at all. I had a big imagination growing up, so I googled folk tales from the region and there were a bunch of results. The Michigan Dogman, Bigfoot, the Wendigo, and some other creatures that don't fit the description of what we're dealing with here. I watched the videos on some of these creatures. I watched a video talking about Bigfoot. Definitely not it. Then I watched one about the Dogman. The claw marks on Steve and my stepdad were similar, but much bigger and deeper than the video showed. Not it. I even watched a video about skinwalkers, but no, we're too far north for them. Then I watched a video about the Wendigo, and the realization hit me like a freight train. Dear Lord, I thought. I wanted to show the others, but I knew they'd get mad at me and yell at me, so I didn't tell them. I still tried to convince myself it was really just a bear, but I knew better. We then sat in silence for another hour or so. Everyone was crying except me. I didn't know Steve and my stepdad was an asshole, so I was more shocked than sad. The silence was broken again, but by the sound of whimpering outside, we looked outside, and it was Blitz. He was hurt but alive. We all ran outside to greet him as he limped towards the house. He had a claw mark along his body. It ran along the entire side of his body, but it wasn't deep at all. My guess was he just got caught in the crossfire of the confrontation last night. Carissa and the mother of the kids both rushed Blitz to the vet, but don't worry, he survived. After we calmed down from excitement of the dog's survival, we returned to the house and so did the woman after a few hours. I went to the basement after some time and found 3 kids all cowering in the corner, crying. Apparently they saw Steve and my stepdad as the medics put them in body bags. Their mom held them and comforted them, but they never calmed down. We were all in a state of panic. We didn't feel safe in the house at all, and we didn't go outside at all that day. We stayed in the house and watched TV all day, and we didn't eat either. It was around 1 a.m. when we all went to bed, but not me. I've always had really bad paranoia, and tonight, my paranoia was 10,000-fold. I would jump at every sound. The house creaked a lot and it scared me every time. It was maybe 3 a.m. when I heard a familiar sound, antlers scraping along the wall outside. The same wall as the deer from the first night, and a sense of comfort came over me, which was quickly overcame by dread when I noticed the scraping was coming from directly on the other side of the wall. The deer from the other night was scraping its antlers, but it sounded like it was coming from the floor. Since I mentioned the main floor is about 5 feet off the ground, but this time the scraping was coming from directly in front of me, and my heart sank. What can stand 10 feet off the ground? I truly thought it was a bear, but a grizzly bear. They're massive, and it was probably marking the house with its claws. I stood there in darkness and silence, waiting for the sounds to stop, and they did, so I quickly made my way to the back door. I crouched down and peeked through the curtain, oh so slightly. Thankfully, they had lights around the backyard, along the tool shed, along the railing of the back deck. There were even light poles that ran all the way from town into the clearing here, and the moon was fully visible too, so I could see outside very well. What I saw was worse than anything I could ever have imagined. It was a creature that looked like a deer of sorts, but it was more the size of a moose. It had huge antlers, bigger than any cervid should have, its mouth slightly agape. It had razor-sharp teeth. Its head was just the skull, no flesh at all. It had fur along its back that looked matted and worn out and had a dark brown, almost black color. The most striking feature of this thing was its size. It was walking quadrupedal and still seemed to be close to 7 feet tall at the shoulder. I let out a quick gasp. I couldn't control my fear. I must have heard it, because it shot its head back towards the house. I watched in horror as it stood up on its hind legs. It stood there and looked at the house intently, which let me get a good look at this thing. It easily stood 12 feet tall. It looked incredibly scrawny and malnourished. Its arms were long, reaching its knees, and its hands ended with huge claws. All those features matched that of a wendigo. At least that's what the video told me. It slowly started walking towards the house. I jumped back on the couch, got under my blanket, and waited for it to go away. I heard its footsteps come onto the deck, but its footsteps were incredibly quiet, which explains why I only heard it when it stepped on the branch the previous night. I saw its shadow creep up to the back door. Its shadow consumed the entire curtain. No moonlight peeked through as it just stood there. My heart sank to my stomach when I remembered I didn't lock the back door before trying to go to bed, and as that thought ran through my head, I heard the door slowly open. I felt the cold air rush in as sweat rushed down my body. I could see the breeze hit the curtains. I then saw a head slowly grab the curtain and slide it aside. The creature opened the door fully so it could fit through, and even then its crown of antlers slowly scraped against the doorway as it walked in. It calmly and quietly searched the kitchen, looking everywhere. I could tell it was looking for something. I watched it intently as it skulked through the darkness towards me. As it walked up to me, now merely few feet away, it seemed to stare at me as if it knew I was there, but couldn't do anything. And I noticed it had a nasty bite in its neck. Blitz damn near ripped its throat out the previous night. It had this awful smell of death, like rotten meat and shit mixed together. I could barely keep myself from vomiting on the beast. Then it did something that surprised me. It extended its hand towards me, not like it was inspecting me or toying with me, but it reached out its hand like it wanted me to take its hand. But I learned from the video that the wendigo loves to trick people, so I just sat there, frozen in fear. I stared at it, its hand still extended, as if things couldn't get stranger. It started talking to me. It had a voice similar to my grandmother's,
Come with me, boy.
in the same fashion she always does. But the voice was off. Instead of sounding out of breath, it sounded annoyed, like how she would sound if I was taking too long. I continued to ignore it, which I think pissed it off, because it gave up, put its hands down, and leaned closer to my face. The smell was unbearable. I just laid there and closed my eyes, accepting death. I felt it open its nasty maw to do me like it did Steve and my stepdad. At that moment, I heard someone coming up the stairs from the basement. The beast heard them and ran out the back door, and in a matter of 2 seconds, it had already vanished into the trees. When I got up to close the door, my grandmother and my mom both appeared behind me. My grandmother said, "Why is the door open, boy?" And I replied, "It was hot in here, and no bear is fast enough to get in here before I close it." They both stood in the kitchen getting something from the fridge, and I noticed the beast left a little bit of blood on the floor, which I quickly wiped up with a paper towel. Thankfully, I got rid of it before they saw it. If they saw the blood, there's no way I could have explained myself. They don't believe in monsters. The next morning, I was more than happy to get out of that hellhole. We drove all the 3 hours back home. Can't believe I met the wendigo. Nothing in my entire life will ever come close to being as scary as that weekend. A few weeks later, we had a closed casket funeral in Grand Rapids, and my mom stopped talking to them after that. I guess there was just too much trauma between them, but they let us have Blitz after that, since our place was much more remote than their place. His scars have healed since then. but his fur is a slightly different color where the scars once were. What was crazy is that about a month after the funeral, Carissa and the whole family went missing overnight. Her friend, the friend's husband, and the 3 kids. Apparently their disappearance was discovered by the same cops that they called that weekend. We read the missing persons report, and all that was found was one blanket and a shoe that belonged to one of the kids. The house was resold about 2 years ago. God forbid the new family has a run-in with that monster. As always, thank you so much for listening, and please hit that like and subscribe button.